9 hikers pitched their tent on a Ural mountainside in February 1959, and then cut their way out of it from the inside, fleeing barefoot into minus 30-degree snow. Some were found half a mile away, with fractured skulls and crushed ribs but no external wounds, and one was missing her tongue. History isn't always missing evidence. Sometimes it preserves just enough to make certainty impossible. A handful of footprints, a damaged tent, a medical report, a weather record. Each survives by chance, but none can explain the others on its own. The result is a mystery that has outlived everyone involved. 9 people never made it off that mountain. Let's find out why. The northern Ural Mountains rise low and worn, shaped by wind rather than time. In winter, the region called Kolatshiako by the native Mansi people, a name that translates unsettlingly to Dead Mountain, disappears under snow that can bury a man standing upright. It was here, on the night of February 1st or 2nd, 1959, that something happened to 9 experienced hikers that has never been fully explained. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, and included 7 other students and 1 experienced outdoorsman. They were skilled. This was not their first expedition into the Urals. Their goal was Odorton Mountain, a demanding but achievable route for a team of their caliber, undertaken as part of a Grade 3 hiking certification. They never arrived. When the group failed to check in by the expected date, search parties were dispatched. What they found, weeks later, defied easy explanation. The hiker's tent had been pitched on the slope of Kolatshiako, and it had been cut open from the inside. Not the entrance flap, unzipped in haste. The fabric itself sliced through, as though something inside that tent made escaping through a wall a more urgent choice than escaping through the door. Footprints in the snow showed that the hikers had fled the tent in socks, in some cases barefoot, in temperatures that likely fell below negative 25 degrees Celsius. They ran toward the tree line, over a kilometer away. Why would trained mountaineers abandon shelter, in that cold, without their boots? The bodies were found in stages over the following months. 2 were discovered near the remains of a small fire beneath a large cedar tree, wearing only underwear. 3 more were found between the fire and the tent, apparently attempting to return. The final 4 were not located until May, buried under several meters of snow in a ravine further into the forest. It was these last 4 whose condition raised the most difficult questions. One woman was missing her tongue, her eyes, and part of her lips. 2 of the men had severe chest fractures, injuries so significant that Soviet investigators compared the force involved to that of a car crash. And yet, none of them showed external wounds consistent with a blunt force attack. No skin was broken. Whatever had crushed their ribs had done so, according to the medical examiner, without breaking the skin at all. The official Soviet investigation, closed in May 1959, attributed the deaths to a compelling natural force. No further detail was given. The files were classified and not made available to the public for decades. In the absence of a satisfying answer, theories accumulated. Some pointed to a slab avalanche, a real, if rare, phenomenon capable of producing the kind of blunt trauma seen in the bodies without leaving visible bruising beneath winter clothing. Others noted the proximity of Soviet military testing sites and wondered whether the group had witnessed something they were never meant to see. A missile test, a weapons trial, an event later scrubbed from the record. A small number of witnesses, including other hikers in the region that same night, reported strange orange lights in the sky. Whether those lights were flares, meteorological phenomena, or something else has never been resolved. What remains consistent across every theory is the tent, cut from the inside, abandoned in the cold by people who understood better than most what the cold could do to an unprepared body. 65 years on, Kholat Syakhl still carries its name. Whatever drove 9 people out into the snow that February night, whether it was the mountain, the military, or something neither official report nor amateur theory has yet named, it left behind a scene that investigators could document in exhaustive detail and still could not explain. Kholat Syakhl sits at roughly 61 degrees north, a mountain so remote that even now it takes days to reach on foot. Nearly 3,000 kilometers to the southwest, in the rolling farmland of Bavaria, there is no mountain at all, only a shallow rise between 2 villages, a patch of ground so unremarkable that a farmhouse could stand there for decades and never draw a second glance. That farmhouse was called Hinterkaifeck. It stood alone, isolated even by the standards of rural Germany, roughly a kilometer from the nearest hamlet, reachable only by a dirt track that cut through the fields. And it was here, in March 1922, that 6 people were killed in a manner so quiet, so methodical, that the murders would go unsolved for over a century. The Hinterkaifeck farmstead was home to Andreas Gross, his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, and Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. A new maid, Maria Baumgartner, had arrived just that day, replacing one who had quit weeks earlier, reportedly frightened by strange occurrences on the property. The household was, by most accounts, an unhappy one. Andreas Gross had a reputation as a difficult and controlling man. Rumors persisted in the village that Victoria's younger child, Joseph, may have been fathered by Andreas himself, rather than by her late husband, a suspicion that, true or not, had followed the family for years and left them socially isolated even from their neighbors. The days leading up to the murders carried a quality that, in hindsight, feels almost staged for unease, though every detail comes from surviving testimony and investigative records, not embellishment. In the weeks before the killings, Andreas Gross told neighbors he had heard footsteps in the attic, footsteps that led nowhere, from a house that should have been empty. He found a newspaper on the property that did not belong to the family, one nobody could account for. A set of strange footprints appeared in the snow, leading from the edge of the forest to the farmhouse, and oddly, none leading back out. Gross searched the grounds. He found nothing. Whatever or whoever had left those tracks seemed to have simply stayed. On the last night of March, 6 people died at Hinterkaifeck, one by one, and the killer did not leave. 4 of the victims, Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and the 7-year-old girl, were found in the barn, lured there individually, investigators believe, and struck down with a mattock, a farming tool with a pick on one end and a blade on the other. The maid and the youngest child were found inside the house, killed the same way. The child, Joseph, is believed by some investigators to have survived the initial attack only to die later, based on the position of the body and disturbed bedding, though this detail remains debated. It would be 4 days before anyone discovered what had happened, and when neighbors finally entered the property, they found something that has never stopped unsettling investigators: evidence that the killer had remained in the house after the murders. The livestock had been fed, meals had been prepared and partially eaten in the kitchen. Smoke had risen from the chimney, seen by passers-by in the days after the family stopped appearing in the village. Someone had stayed at Hinterkaifeck, moving through those rooms, past those bodies, tending to a household that no longer had anyone left to care for it, for the better part of 4 days. Why? The bodies were carried to the barn and stacked, then covered with straw. Investigators at the time noted the killer had made some effort at concealment, however incomplete, suggesting intent to delay discovery rather than an act of pure frenzy. And yet nothing was stolen. A considerable sum of money was later found untouched in the house. Whatever drove this killing, robbery does not appear to have been the motive, which leaves the far harder question of what was. The original investigation, conducted with the forensic tools available in 1922, produced dozens of suspects and no conviction. Villagers were questioned. Victoria's former husband, officially dead in the First World War, was floated as a candidate by rumor alone. What if he had returned, learned of Joseph's parentage, and taken his revenge? Andreas Gross's own erratic behavior in his final weeks made him, in the eyes of some investigators, someone with knowledge he never shared. Others suspected a local man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor and former suitor of Victoria's, who behaved strangely at the crime scene and was arrested more than once over the following decades, though never convicted. In 2007, a team from the University of Munich reopened the case using modern forensic methods, generating a renewed list of suspects from the original evidence. Even then, no definitive answer emerged. The physical evidence had degraded across 8 decades. The witnesses were long dead. The mattock, believed to be the murder weapon, had vanished. What remains is a farmhouse that no longer exists. It was demolished in 1923, its materials reportedly picked apart by souvenir hunters and villagers eager to erase it from the landscape, and a case file thick with theory but empty of resolution. Was it a jealous former son-in-law, returning under cover of rumor and war record confusion? A neighbor with a grievance decades in the making? Or someone entirely outside the family's world? A stranger who left footprints leading only inward, and who calmly ate the family's food and fed their cattle in the days after taking their lives? No one was ever convicted. No confession was ever recorded. And the question that has followed Hinterkaifeck since the spring of 1922 remains exactly where investigators left it. If the killer stayed for 4 days, surrounded by the dead, what precisely were they waiting for? Some miles north, where the mountains grow steeper and the fjords cut deeper into the land, there is a valley the locals call Isdalen, the Ice Valley. It sits just outside Bergen, Norway, a place better known for its wooden houses and its rain than for anything sinister. And yet, on a cold morning in November 1970, this quiet valley would give up a secret that has never been fully explained. It began with a father and his 2 young daughters out for a walk on the morning of November 29th. Isdalen was a popular route for hikers, a place where the ground rises steeply between bare rock faces, and where, even in late autumn, the air carries a particular stillness. As they moved along a narrow path, the smell reached them first, something acrid, something wrong. Then they saw it. A body, badly burned, lying among the rocks. Beside it, scattered as though flung outward by heat or violence, were the remnants of a life that no one could identify. The Bergen police arrived to find a scene that seemed, at first glance, almost staged. The woman, for it was clear the victim was a woman, likely in her 20s or 30s, had been burned so severely that her face was unrecognizable. She wore no jewelry. Her clothing tags had been carefully removed. Nearby lay an umbrella, rubber boots, a passport-sized photograph, and 2 burned suitcases. When investigators traced the labels within those suitcases, they found something curious. Every single one had been cut out. Someone, it seemed, had spent considerable effort ensuring this woman could not be identified. Not by her clothes, not by her belongings, and, as they would soon discover, not easily by anything else either. An autopsy revealed a cause of death that was itself contradictory. The woman had ingested a large quantity of sleeping pills, enough to kill her outright, and yet she had also suffered blunt force trauma to the neck, along with the severe burns. Had she taken the pills and then been set alight while still alive? Had someone struck her first? The medical evidence allowed for several sequences of events, and to this day no examiner has been able to say with total confidence which one occurred, or in what order. What made the case extraordinary wasn't only the manner of death, it was everything that came before it. In the weeks leading up to her death, this woman had been staying in hotels across Bergen, checking in and out under a rotating cast of aliases: Fenella Lorck, Claudia Tielt, Vera Schlosseneck, Genevieve Lancier, and several others. She spoke multiple languages fluently, switching between them depending on who she spoke to. Hotel staff remembered her as elegant, well-dressed, and careful, a woman who paid in cash, who avoided registering her true nationality, and who altered small details of her passport by hand. When police searched her hotel room, they found further oddities. Her belongings included cosmetics with labels removed and notebooks filled with coded entries, sequences of numbers and letters that, decades later, still resist full decryption. Some entries appeared to log cities she had visited: Paris, Hamburg, Antwerp, Geneva. Others suggested dates and codes whose meaning has never been agreed upon. Investigators at the time noted that her pattern of movement, frequent border crossings, disguises, false identities, resembled something out of an intelligence dossier rather than an ordinary traveler's diary. It was this resemblance that gave rise to the theory for which the Isdal Woman is best remembered, that she may have been a spy. Norway, in 1970, sat at a delicate point in the Cold War, close enough to Soviet waters and NATO installations to be of genuine strategic interest. Witnesses recalled seeing the woman near military-adjacent areas in the months before her death. Some researchers have pointed to her fluency in several languages, her use of disguises, and her meticulous efforts to erase any trace of her real identity as evidence that she was engaged in some form of surveillance or courier work. Perhaps for one side of the conflict, perhaps for more than one. Others regard this reading as speculation dressed up in the language of intrigue, noting that no government has ever acknowledged her, and no intelligence agency, East or West, has ever claimed her as their own. For decades, her true name remained entirely unknown. She was buried in an unmarked grave in Bergen, a woman without a country, without a family to claim her. It wasn't until 2016, nearly half a century later, that researchers using forensic isotope analysis and DNA testing were able to narrow her likely origins to somewhere in continental Europe, possibly the border regions between France and Germany. Even this breakthrough, however, offered no name, no next of kin, no resolution. The isotopes could describe where she had lived. They could not say who she was or why she died in a lonely Norwegian valley with her identity so thoroughly, so deliberately erased. What remains, then, is a woman defined almost entirely by absence, by labels cut from clothing, by a face too damaged to reveal itself, by a name that may never surface from beneath the aliases she left behind. Was she fleeing someone or being pursued? Did she die by her own hand, staging one final disappearance, or was the disappearance done to her? Bergen's police files on the case remain even now partially sealed. Somewhere, perhaps, a family still wonders what became of a daughter, a sister, a colleague who simply stopped writing home. And in Isdalen, where the wind moves through the rocks much as it did that November morning, the valley keeps whatever else it might know entirely to itself. Notebooks, it seems, have a way of outliving the people who write in them. In Bergen, hers held numbers no one could decode. Half a world away, in Brazil, another set of handwritten pages would surface, this time inside the pocket of a man's coat, filled with instructions that read less like a diary and more like a ritual. The hillside is called Morro do Vintem, a steep, forested rise on the outskirts of Niterói, just across the bay from Rio de Janeiro. In August of 1966, it was overgrown and difficult to climb, the kind of place locals visited for its view, not for anything hidden among its brush. On August 20th, a boy flying a kite noticed something strange partway up the slope. Two men, lying side by side, dressed in suits, each wearing a strange metallic mask over his eyes. He alerted the police, and what they found when they climbed to the site would become one of Brazil's most enduring unsolved mysteries. The two men were identified fairly quickly. Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana were electronics technicians from Campos dos Goitacazes, a city roughly 200 kilometers away. Both were in their 30s, both had families, and neither had any known history of violence, illness, or instability. They had traveled to Niterói together, telling relatives only that they were going on a work trip. Nothing about their departure suggested anything was wrong. What investigators found at the scene, however, resisted easy explanation. The men lay on their backs, arms at their sides, positioned with an almost deliberate neatness, not the sprawl one would expect from a struggle or a fall. Over their eyes, each wore a mask fashioned from lead sheeting, the kind sometimes used to shield against radiation. Their suits were clean, undamaged, giving no indication of a struggle. There were no visible wounds, no signs of violence anywhere on their bodies. And yet both men were dead, with no immediately apparent cause. Nearby, police recovered a small notebook, and inside it, a set of handwritten instructions that would come to define the case in the public imagination. The notes described a precise sequence of actions: to take a specific medication at a designated hour, to don the masks at the appointed moment, and to wait, sheltered from the light, for the arrival of someone or something described only as E.T. Whether E.T. referred to an extraterrestrial, as many later assumed, or was shorthand for something far more mundane, a person's initials, a code name, a term from their work in electronics, has never been established. The notebook offered no further explanation, and no other document has ever surfaced to clarify it. The autopsy deepened the puzzle rather than resolving it. Initial toxicology reports were inconclusive, hampered by the state of the remains and the limits of 1960s forensic science. No poison was conclusively identified. No trauma was found sufficient to explain death. Investigators noted a strange detail: a slight foam around the mouths of both men, but attempts to determine its cause led nowhere definitive. Officially, the case was closed without ever identifying a mechanism of death, let alone a motive or a culprit. In the years that followed, explanations multiplied to fill the space the evidence had left empty. The most grounded theory points to the men's line of work. Both were skilled amateur electronics builders, and some researchers have suggested they may have been experimenting with a homemade device, perhaps involving a toxic substance related to rocket fuel or industrial chemicals, and the lead masks were meant to protect their eyes rather than block out visions of anything otherworldly. If something in their experiment released a poisonous gas, both men might have died within moments of each other, collapsing into the calm, symmetrical positions in which they were found. Others have proposed the men were part of a spiritist or mystical group, drawing on Brazil's rich tradition of syncretic religious practice, and that the notebook's instructions describe a ritual meant to bring about contact with a spirit or a higher power. E.T. understood not as visitors from another planet, but as an entity from another realm entirely. Under this reading, the lead masks were not protective equipment, but ceremonial objects, meant to shield the wearers from a light they were not yet prepared to see. And then, inevitably, there are the theories that reach further still, that the men had been in contact with, or were expecting contact from, something not of this world altogether, that the precise, almost ceremonial arrangement of the bodies suggests an encounter deliberately staged, whether by the men themselves or by someone, or something, else entirely. Ufologists have studied this case for decades, drawn to details that seem to resist conventional explanation. The absence of trauma, the strange notebook, the masks themselves, engineered specifically to block visible light. What can be said with certainty is only this: two ordinary men climbed a quiet hillside outside Rio de Janeiro, prepared for something they believed was coming, and never came back down. Whatever they were waiting for, whether chemical, spiritual, or something else altogether, arrived. Or perhaps it never did, and it was only their own preparations that undid them. More than half a century later, the notebook's final lines remain as opaque as the day they were written, and the hillside keeps its silence, indifferent to which explanation, if any, is the true one. Wind. That is what you notice first. Not silence, but wind, constant and enormous, moving over open water with nothing to break it for miles. It is the sound the Flannan Isles have made for thousands of years, and the sound that, on a December night in 1900, may have been the last thing three men ever heard. The Flannan Isles sit roughly 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis, in the outer reaches of Scotland's Hebrides, a scattered cluster of small, rocky islands, so remote and so battered by the North Atlantic that they were long considered uninhabitable, fit only for seabirds and the occasional shepherd's visit. Locally, they were sometimes called the Seven Hunters, and for centuries fishermen regarded them with a certain wariness, a place governed by old superstitions about who was permitted to set foot there and how. It was on the largest of these islands, Island Moor, that the Northern Lighthouse Board completed construction of a lighthouse in 1899, standing sentinel over waters that had claimed more ships than anyone could easily count. The lighthouse was manned by a rotating crew of 3 keepers, with a 4th kept on shore as relief. On the 26th of December 1900, the steamer Archer passed near the islands and reported something troubling to authorities upon reaching port. The lighthouse's light was not lit. This was no small observation. A lighthouse going dark was a matter of maritime safety, and the report was taken seriously, though poor weather delayed a response for several days. When the relief vessel Hesperus finally reached Island Moor on the 26th of December, the crew found no one waiting at the landing, no signal answering their approach, and, most unsettling of all, no one to greet them at the lighthouse itself. The Hesperus's captain sent a man ashore. What he found was a lighthouse in an eerie state of order and disorder at once. The beds were unmade. A chair lay overturned near the kitchen table. And yet the clocks had stopped, the fire in the hearth was long cold, and the last entries in the keeper's log painted a picture of ordinary days, until they abruptly did not. The log entries themselves have become perhaps the most quoted, most scrutinized fragment of the entire mystery. In the days leading up to their disappearance, the keepers had recorded severe weather, high winds, heavy seas, and there are references to one of the men, Donald MacArthur, described as unusually distressed, even to the point of weeping. Later entries mention the wind easing, the sea calming, and preparations being made to secure equipment outside. And then, nothing. No sign of a struggle. No indication that the men had planned to leave. Their oilskin coats, ordinarily required for venturing outside in rough weather, were found still hanging inside the lighthouse, all except one. What happened to Donald MacArthur, James Ducat, and Thomas Marshall has never been definitively established. The most widely accepted explanation, then and now, involves the sea itself. The western landing of Island Moor sat exposed to the full force of Atlantic swells, and investigators at the time theorized that one or more of the men may have gone out to secure equipment or check on storm damage near this landing, only to be struck by a rogue wave, a wall of water large enough to sweep a man from the rocks without warning, and without leaving any trace behind. If the others rushed to help, all 3 could have been lost within moments, victims not of any human hand, but of a sea that has claimed lives on these islands both before and since. And yet, careful readers of the case have long pointed to details that seem to sit awkwardly within this explanation. Some investigators noted damage to equipment at a height that seemed difficult for a wave to reach, though accounts of this detail vary and have been disputed over the decades. The stopped clocks, the overturned chair, and the untouched meal have each, at different points, been offered as evidence of something more sudden, more violent, or simply more strange than a storm. Predictably, in the absence of certainty, other explanations have taken root. Some point to the long-standing folklore surrounding the islands themselves, old beliefs that the Flannan Isles were the domain of spirits, and that those who visited were expected to observe certain rites of respect, lest something ill befall them. Others have speculated about foreign vessels, sea monsters, or even, in the wilder corners of the theory, the involvement of something not of this earth. Serious historians tend to set these aside, favoring the sea as the likeliest culprit. But the sea, for all its power, has never explained why one oilskin coat was missing while the others remained, or why a chair was found overturned in an otherwise composed room. What remains today is the lighthouse itself, automated now, standing largely unattended over the same restless water. The wind has not changed. It still moves over Eilean Moor exactly as it did in December of 1900, indifferent to the questions it has never answered. Did 3 men lose their lives to a wave no one could have predicted, or did something else visit that lonely island in the days before Christmas? The Flannan Isles keep their answer, if they have one, exactly where they have always kept it, beneath the sound of the wind and the sea that never stops moving. Water and wind have swallowed evidence before, but sometimes it is a mountain, and the cold that keeps its own kind of silence. There is a range in California where that silence found 5 men who went out to watch a basketball game and were never fully explained again. Marysville, California, sits in the flatlands of Yuba County, a modest agricultural community northeast of Sacramento. From there, the land begins to climb, toward the Sierra Nevada, toward Plumas National Forest, toward country that turns brutal and unforgiving once winter sets in. It was into this rising terrain that a truck belonging to 5 young men was found abandoned on February 24, 1978, stuck in snow along a remote forest road. Its doors unlocked, the keys left inside, and a tank still nearly full of gas. The 5 men, Ted Wire, Jack Madruga, Jack Hewitt, Bill Sterling, and Gary Mathias, had left Yuba City the night before to attend a college basketball game in Chico, about 50 miles away. All 5 had, to varying degrees, intellectual or developmental disabilities, and all were well known in their community as close friends who looked out for one another. Witnesses at the game confirmed they had watched it in its entirety and left together afterward, in good spirits, with no apparent plans beyond returning home. That return never happened. When search parties eventually located Madruga's Mercury Montego, it sat roughly 70 miles off the most direct route back to Yuba City, on a forest road deep in the mountains, nowhere near any path that made obvious sense. It was not, by most accounts, seriously stuck. Searchers noted the vehicle could likely have been freed with modest effort. Inside, investigators found the men's coats still folded on the seats, along with unopened food and other supplies, suggesting that whatever prompted them to leave the truck, it had not been done in a state of prepared, deliberate decision-making. And yet, leave it they did, walking out into a landscape that, in February, held snow, freezing temperatures and country capable of disorienting even experienced outdoorsmen. For weeks, search efforts turned up nothing. Then, in June, a mountain trail crew stumbled upon a trailer belonging to the Forest Service, roughly 19 miles from where the truck had been abandoned. Inside, they found the remains of Ted Wire. He had survived for a considerable time after the disappearance, investigators estimated weeks, based on his body weight and physical condition when found, using what supplies the unoccupied trailer offered, though not, curiously, all of them. He was found wrapped in layers of clothing and blankets far beyond what seemed necessary, as though dressing against a cold that had already become fatal, and his weight had dropped severely despite there being food available nearby that had gone untouched. Searchers also noted burned matchsticks scattered at the site, suggesting repeated, perhaps increasingly desperate, attempts to start a fire that never fully caught. The remains of Jack Hewitt and Bill Sterling would eventually be found separately in the surrounding wilderness. Months and, in one case years later, their exact fates never clearly reconstructed. Jack Madruga's remains were located as well, some distance from the others. Gary Mathias alone was never found at all. No remains, no possessions, no confirmed trace, then or since. What could have driven 5 men, 3 of whom had limited experience with wilderness survival, to leave a functioning vehicle and walk deep into the mountains in the middle of winter? The most grounded theories point to simple human error compounded by tragedy. Perhaps the group became lost after a wrong turn, panicked in unfamiliar terrain, and made a series of decisions, understandable in the moment, catastrophic in hindsight, that led them further from safety rather than toward it. Confusion, cold, and the particular psychology of group panic have led hikers astray before, sometimes with equally devastating results. Yet certain details resist easy absorption into this narrative. Gary Mathias had a service record that included accounts of psychiatric episodes, and some investigators have wondered whether a crisis on his part might have precipitated the group's departure from the truck, though nothing conclusive has ever tied his history directly to the events of that night. Others have pointed to reports, never fully substantiated, of unusual lights or sounds in the area around the time of the disappearance, giving rise to speculation involving encounters far outside the ordinary explanations of cold and confusion. Still others simply note how strange it is that Vire, found in a trailer stocked with supplies, seemed to have starved despite food remaining nearby, and ask whether fear, illness, or something not yet understood might have played a role in that final, inexplicable restraint. No account offered in the decades since has managed to explain every detail of the Yuba County 5 with total satisfaction. Not the abandoned truck with fuel to spare. Not Wire's careful, futile layering against the cold. Not the matches struck again and again beside a fire that would not hold. And certainly not the complete and total absence of Gary Mathias, whose fate remains, more than 40 years later, entirely unaccounted for. The Sierra Nevada holds its secrets the way it holds its snow, deep and slow to give anything back. Somewhere in that terrain, or perhaps nowhere at all anymore, lies whatever answer would finally make sense of a night that, so far, still refuses to. It is worth pausing here to notice a pattern. Again and again in these cases, the last trace left behind is something small and domestic. A coat, a chair, a folded blanket, ordinary objects made unbearable by what surrounds them. Nowhere is that truer than in a quiet house in the Ozarks, where 3 women vanished so completely that even their front door was left standing open. Springfield, Missouri, in the summer of 1992, was not a place accustomed to headlines. It was a mid-sized city in the American heartland, the kind of community where neighbors still noticed unfamiliar cars and where a missing persons case, let alone 3 at once, was almost unthinkable. On the night of June 6th, 3 women, Susie Streeter, aged 19, her mother Cheryl Levitt, 47, and Susie's friend Stacy McCall, 18, spent time together at Cheryl's house on East Delmer Street after a night out celebrating Stacy's high school graduation. By all accounts, it was an unremarkable evening, filled with the ordinary rituals of a summer night. Friends stopping by, plans loosely made for the following day. By morning, all three were gone. When Stacy's mother arrived at the house the next day, expecting to find the young women preparing for a pool outing, she found something deeply wrong instead. The front door was unlocked, and the porch light above it had been shattered, its broken glass scattered on the ground below, a detail that has never been satisfactorily explained. Inside, the house appeared largely undisturbed. Purses, keys, and identification remained untouched. Cheryl's cat wound calmly through the rooms. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, nothing overtly out of place, only an emptiness where 3 lives had been the night before. Investigators arrived to a scene that offered frustratingly little to work with. The women's cars remained parked outside, exactly where they had been left. Nothing of obvious value was missing. In a case where evidence should have accumulated, it instead seemed to recede. No footprints of significance, no forensic trace strong enough to build a narrative, no witnesses who had seen anything unusual on a residential street in the middle of the night. Whoever, or whatever, took Susie, Cheryl, and Stacy from that house did so with a quiet efficiency that left almost nothing behind, apart from that one broken porch light and an open door. In the years since, investigators have pursued numerous leads, some of them substantial enough to generate genuine hope of resolution. Susie Streeter had, in the months before the disappearance, been involved in a legal dispute connected to a party at the same house, and some investigators have wondered whether this created friction with someone motivated enough to act. Convicted criminals have, at different points, been named as persons of interest, their proximity to the case scrutinized by both law enforcement and independent researchers, though none have ever been definitively tied to the women's disappearance through physical evidence. Cadaver dogs were brought to various properties over the years, occasionally producing responses that suggested searchers were close to something, though nothing has ever been confirmed as a result of these efforts. The case has drawn national attention more than once, appearing on television programs devoted to unsolved mysteries and prompting renewed tips whenever it resurfaces in public memory. A reward, growing over the decades through community and organizational contributions, has climbed into 6 figures, offered to anyone who can provide information leading to a resolution. And yet, more than 30 years on, no arrest has been made, no remains have been recovered, and no account has emerged that investigators regard as conclusively true. Where mainstream theories point to a targeted act, connected perhaps to Susie's earlier legal troubles or to an intruder known to the household, others have speculated further afield, that the women may have encountered a stranger passing through Springfield, someone with no prior connection to them at all, which would explain both the case's stubborn resistance to conventional investigative leads and the near-total absence of physical evidence. Still, others have focused on that shattered porch light as a detail too specific to be incidental, wondering whether it points to a deliberate first act meant to darken the property before whatever followed inside. What is known with certainty is unsettlingly small. 3 women were present in a house on a summer night. By morning, the house stood open, its light broken, and its occupants gone without a struggle anyone has been able to identify. Somewhere, someone likely knows what happened on East Delmar Street in the early hours of June 7, 1992. For more than 3 decades, that knowledge has stayed just outside the reach of every investigation, every tip, and every reward offered in its pursuit, leaving Springfield with a question it has never stopped asking, even as the trail, like so much else in this case, has grown quieter with each passing year. Among those who search for missing people, there exists a particular kind of expertise, earned not in classrooms but in the field, learned from terrain that punishes carelessness. It was hikers of exactly this kind, a group of experienced young trekkers from Irkutsk who set out into the mountains of southern Siberia in the summer of 1993, confident in skills that had carried them safely through wilderness before. the Khamar-Daban range rises along the southern edge of Lake Baikal in the Buryatia region of Russia, a remote stretch of taiga and alpine terrain known for sudden weather shifts and a landscape that offers little mercy to those caught unprepared. In late July and early August of 1993, a group of 6 hikers, most of them teenagers led by an experienced 20-year-old guide named Lyudmila Korovina, ventured into these mountains as part of a planned trek. They were not novices. Korovina had led groups through difficult terrain before, and by most accounts the group was well equipped and disciplined in its approach to the journey. On August 5th, while descending from a mountain pass, the group encountered a violent and rapidly intensifying storm. Heavy rain, powerful wind, and a drop in temperature severe enough to threaten hypothermia even in summer. What followed, according to the lone survivor's later account, unfolded with a speed that left little room for response. Within a short span of time, 5 of the 6 hikers died. Only one, a teenager named Valentina Utochkina, survived to describe what had happened, though her account, given the chaos and trauma of the event, has never fully satisfied investigators seeking a precise sequence of cause and effect. The deaths themselves presented investigators with a puzzle that mainstream explanations have struggled to close entirely. Witnesses and later examiners noted froth or fluid around the mouths of several victims, along with reports of the hikers behaving erratically in their final hours, disoriented, agitated, in ways that seemed to exceed what exposure and fear alone might produce. Korovina, the experienced guide upon whom the group depended, reportedly succumbed early in the crisis, which some have found difficult to reconcile with her prior experience and physical conditioning. The order and speed of the deaths, more than the deaths themselves, is what has kept this case unsettled for over 30 years. The most widely accepted explanation centers on a combination familiar to mountaineering tragedies: severe hypothermia compounded by panic. A sudden storm at altitude can lower body temperature with startling speed, and hypothermia is known to produce confusion, poor decision-making, and, in advanced stages, irrational or erratic behavior that might account for the disoriented final hours described by the survivor. Under this reading, the group's discipline and experience were simply not enough to overcome a storm violent enough and sudden enough to overwhelm them before proper shelter could be reached. Yet, for some researchers, this explanation has never fully accounted for every detail of the case. The froth observed on several victims has led some to propose a toxicological explanation instead: the possibility that the group inadvertently consumed something contaminated, whether through water, foraged plants, or spoiled supplies, and that a toxic reaction, rather than the storm alone, drove the erratic behavior and rapid deaths investigators struggled to explain through weather conditions alone. Soviet and later Russian investigations into the region's geology have also noted unusual atmospheric and electromagnetic phenomena reported around the Khamar-Daban range and nearby Lake Baikal over the years, and a small number of researchers have wondered, without ever establishing a mechanism, whether some environmental factor unique to the area might have played a role that summer. Inevitably, given the case's unresolved nature, more speculative theories have taken hold in the decades since, some pointing to infrasound, a phenomenon known in limited contexts to produce disorientation and panic in exposed individuals, given the mountainous terrain's capacity to generate unusual acoustic conditions during violent storms. Others, drawing on Baikal's long-standing reputation in regional folklore as a place of unusual and sometimes unexplainable events, have framed the tragedy in terms that extend beyond conventional science altogether. None of these theories have displaced the storm and hypothermia explanation as the most broadly accepted account, but none have been definitively ruled out either, largely because so much of the physical evidence from 1993 was limited by the investigative tools available at the time. What remains constant across every retelling is the outcome. 5 experienced young hikers, led by a capable guide, died within a remarkably short window of time on a mountainside that should not, by ordinary logic, have proven fatal to a group so well prepared. Valentina survived to tell what she could, but her account has never closed the gap between what is known and what actually happened on that slope. The Khamar-Daban Range remains as remote today as it was in 1993. Its storms just as capable of turning violent without warning. And whatever truly took hold of that group in its final hours continues to rest somewhere between the peer-reviewed explanation and the folklore that has grown up around it, waiting, perhaps, for evidence that may simply no longer exist to find. 13 years before that storm broke over Khamar-Daban on the other side of the world, a different mystery had already been sitting unsolved for decades, one that would, in time, become perhaps the most famous unidentified body case in modern history. To find it, we travel back further still, to a beach in southern Australia on a summer morning in December 1948. Somerton Park is a quiet seaside suburb of Adelaide, its beach popular with families and morning walkers drawn to the mild curve of St. Vincent Gulf. On the morning of December 1st, 1948, a well-dressed man was found lying against the seawall, his posture almost casual, legs extended, head resting as though he had simply fallen asleep in the sun. Passers-by who noticed him assumed exactly that. It was only later in the day, when he had not moved, that someone approached closely enough to realize he was dead. The man carried no wallet, no identification of any kind, and every label had been carefully removed from his clothing. An autopsy failed to determine a clear cause of death, though the pathologist noted signs suggestive of poisoning, without ever isolating a specific substance responsible. His fingerprints matched no criminal or civil record, in Australia or eventually abroad. Dental records led nowhere. Circulated photographs and physical descriptions, published widely in the press, produced no one able to confirm his identity. He became simply the Somerton Man, a label that has outlasted every other name proposed for him since. Months after his death, investigators made a discovery that would come to define the case in public memory. A small, tightly rolled scrap of paper was found sewn into a hidden pocket within the man's trousers, a pocket investigators believed had been specifically designed to conceal it. On the paper were 2 printed words, Tamam Shud, Persian for "it is finished" or "it is ended," torn from the final page of a rare edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The search for the specific book from which the page had been torn led, remarkably, to its discovery, tossed into the back of an unlocked car parked nearby in the weeks after the man's death. Inside its back cover, investigators found something perhaps even stranger than the torn page itself. A faint penciled sequence of letters, arranged in rows, resembling a code. Alongside it was an unlisted telephone number, which led police to a woman living nearby, a former nurse, who denied any knowledge of the man's identity, though her reaction upon being shown a plaster cast of his face has, in the decades since, drawn considerable scrutiny and speculation of its own. The coded letters have never been definitively deciphered. Cryptographers, both amateur and professional, have proposed numerous readings over the years, ranging from a simple mnemonic device or set of initials to something considerably more elaborate. That ambiguity, more than perhaps any other element of the case, has allowed the Somerton Man's story to expand well beyond an ordinary unsolved death. For years, the most persistent theory held that the man had been a Cold War-era spy. his death connected to espionage in a period when Australia's proximity to sensitive military testing sites made it a genuine point of interest to intelligence services on more than one side of the conflict. The unidentifiable poisoning, the removed clothing labels, the coded message, and the general absence of any ordinary explanation for his presence in Adelaide all fed into this reading, one that dominated public fascination with the case for decades. In 2022, new forensic genealogy work identified the Somerton Man as Carl Charles Webb, an engineer born in Melbourne, using DNA extracted from hair recovered from a plaster cast made shortly after his death. This identification, while resolving the question of his name, has not resolved the far stranger elements that made the case famous in the first place. Why were his clothing labels removed? What was the significance of the phrase "it is finished," deliberately hidden in a specially sewn pocket? What do the penciled letters in the back of the book actually say? And why has cryptographic analysis never converged on a single agreed-upon answer? And why, if his identity was simply that of an ordinary engineer, did his death present with so many of the hallmarks investigators once associated with something far more deliberate? Even with a name finally attached to the man on the seawall, the manner and meaning of his death remain unresolved. Was Carl Webb's end simply personal tragedy, dressed in circumstances that happened to resemble intrigue? Or does the coded message still folded into that library book point toward something about his final days that forensic genealogy was never equipped to uncover? More than 75 years on, the phrase found in his pocket continues to raise more questions than it answers. A man's name recovered at last, but the story behind it is finished still, in every meaningful sense, unfinished. A folded note, a handwritten message left behind for someone to find. Such objects have a way of recurring in cases like these, carrying meaning their authors likely never intended for strangers to parse. In the case that follows, it was not a torn page from a poem, but a single word scrawled on a legal pad, left behind on a kitchen counter in the high desert of Oklahoma. The Jamisons lived outside Eufaula, Oklahoma, in Muskogee County, a region defined by rolling hills, dense woodland, and the wide waters of Eufaula Lake. Bobby Dale Jamison, his wife Sherilyn, and their 4-year-old daughter Madison lived a life that, from the outside, appeared stable and unremarkable. Bobby worked various jobs, including at a local dealership, while Sherilyn cared for Madison. Friends and family described a close-knit, ordinary family, with no history that suggested anything resembling the events that would come. On October 8, 2009, the Jamisons were last seen at a local Walmart, caught on surveillance footage making a purchase before returning home. It would be the final confirmed sighting of any of them. When family members grew concerned after days of silence, a welfare check at their home revealed a scene that, much like the Springfield house nearly 2 decades earlier, offered investigators almost nothing to work with, and yet somehow suggested that something had gone deeply wrong. The house itself showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. Furniture stood undisturbed. The family's beloved dogs remained inside, apparently uncared for over some period of time, which weighed heavily on investigators trying to establish a timeline. Personal belongings, including purses and identification, were left behind. And on the kitchen counter, investigators found a legal pad bearing a single, unexplained word, written in Bobby's handwriting: back. What it referred to, whether a note left for someone expected to return, an unfinished thought, or something else entirely, has never been determined. It remains, to this day, one of the case's most quietly haunting details. Perhaps more troubling than what was found inside the home was what was discovered outside it. The family's truck was located at the property, and inside investigators found a substantial amount of cash, along with the family's cell phones, and, according to reports, prescription medications belonging to family members. The presence of so much money left untouched inside an abandoned vehicle complicated straightforward theories of robbery or a financially motivated crime, while simultaneously raising new questions about what the family might have been preparing for or fleeing from in the days before they vanished. For over a year, the case remained a true absence. No bodies, no confirmed sightings despite a nationally publicized search, and a set of investigative leads that consistently failed to cohere into a clear narrative. Then, in November 2013, more than 4 years after they were last seen, hunters in a remote, wooded area of Eufaula, several miles from the family's property, discovered skeletal remains. Forensic analysis eventually confirmed that all 3 Jamisons, Bobby, Sherilyn, and young Madison, had been found in this same secluded stretch of woods. The discovery answered one question while leaving nearly every other one intact. Authorities determined that the family had likely died from exposure, a devastating possibility given Madison's age and the length of time she and her parents were reportedly missing before their deaths, based on evidence at the scene. But this explanation, however clinical it may sound in an official report, has never sat entirely comfortably with the broader facts of the case. Why would a family with a home, a vehicle, and financial resources on hand end up stranded, on foot, deep in wooded terrain, far from any obvious path they might reasonably have taken? What set of circumstances could compel a mother and father to walk their 4-year-old daughter into remote wilderness, seemingly without adequate supplies, and never return? Investigators have pursued several threads in search of an answer. Some point to Bobby Jamison's reported financial dealings in the months before the disappearance, including money owed to him by others and unresolved business matters, wondering whether fear of some kind, targeted or otherwise, might have prompted the family to flee their home suddenly, taking only what they could carry and becoming lost or trapped by circumstances they had not anticipated. This theory attempts to explain the untouched cash in the truck, the dogs left uncared for, and the single cryptic word on the legal pad, framing them as fragments of a hurried, frightened departure rather than a planned one. Others have focused more specifically on the region itself, an area with a long documented history of unusual reports among hunters and hikers, including strange lights, unexplained sounds, and a persistent unease that some who know the woods around Eufaula describe, though such accounts remain, as always, anecdotal rather than evidentiary. A smaller number of researchers, drawn to the case's stranger details, have wondered whether the family might have encountered someone in those woods, an event that led them further from safety rather than toward it, though no physical evidence recovered with the remains has ever been confirmed to support this reading over the more straightforward account of exposure and misfortune. What can be said with confidence is only the shape of the tragedy itself. A family of 3, financially stable, without any documented history suggesting they would simply walk away from their lives, vanished from a home that showed no violence, leaving behind money, belongings, and a single unexplained word, only to be found years later in woodland many miles from where anyone expected them to be. Muscogee County's investigators closed the case without ever fully reconciling that gap between the evidence they had and the explanation it seemed to demand. Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison are no longer missing in the sense that matters most to grieving families, their remains recovered, their fates in the barest sense resolved. And yet the deeper question of what actually happened in the days after that final Walmart appearance, of what compelled them from a secure home into the wilderness that would ultimately claim them, remains as unanswered now as it was when investigators first stood in that quiet kitchen, staring at a legal pad and a single word that no one has ever been able to explain. From the wooded stillness of eastern Oklahoma, the scene shifts entirely to a city built on reinvention, where sidewalks run past palm trees and studio backlots, and where, on a January morning in 1947, an ordinary vacant lot would become the site of one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. Leimert Park, in 1947, was a quiet, developing residential neighborhood in Los Angeles, its streets lined with new construction and empty lots still waiting to be filled. On the morning of January 15th, a young mother walking with her daughter came upon what she first believed to be a discarded mannequin lying in the weeds of one such empty lot. It was not a mannequin. It was the body of a young woman, and the manner in which she had been found would ensure the case gripped the public imagination for generations to come. The victim was soon identified as Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old woman who had come to Los Angeles, as so many young women did in that era, drawn by the promise of the film industry and the particular kind of reinvention Southern California seemed to offer. She had worked various jobs, moved between residences and acquaintances, and was, by most accounts, a striking, well-liked presence among those who knew her, though her precise activities in the days before her death remain, even now, difficult to fully reconstruct. Newspapers, seizing on both the brutality of her death and a nickname reportedly drawn from her dark hair and the dramatic fashion of the period, would soon christen her the Black Dahlia, a name that has long since eclipsed her own in public memory. The condition in which Short was found shocked even seasoned investigators, and the specifics widely reported at the time established the murder as something far outside the ordinary run of homicide cases the LAPD encountered. Her body showed evidence of extensive torture prior to death, along with post-mortem mutilation carried out with what examiners described as considerable surgical precision. Precision that would, in the years since, fuel one of the case's most persistent lines of speculation: that whoever committed the crime possessed some degree of medical or anatomical training. The body had also, notably, been cleaned and drained of blood before being deliberately positioned in the lot, suggesting the killing itself had occurred elsewhere, with the location where she was found serving only as a final, calculated placement. In the days following the discovery, the case escalated in a manner almost as strange as the murder itself. Someone claiming responsibility began sending communications to newspapers and police, including items reported to belong to Short, and eventually a package containing some of her personal effects, along with a note assembled from letters cut from newspaper print. Whether these communications came from the actual killer or from an opportunist exploiting a sensational case remains, to this day, entirely unresolved, and investigators at the time were never able to definitively authenticate the sender's identity. The subsequent investigation ballooned into one of the largest in LAPD history, with detectives ultimately interviewing many dozens of suspects and reviewing an enormous volume of tips generated by the case's extraordinary press coverage. And yet, for all that effort, no arrest was ever made. No individual was ever charged. The case file grew for decades, occasionally reopened, occasionally narrowed toward a particular name, without ever producing the conclusive evidence needed to close it. Mainstream theories about Short's killer have tended to cluster around a small number of recurring threads. Some investigators, both at the time and in later reviews of the case, focused on individuals within Short's circle of acquaintances, men she had reportedly dated or associated with in the weeks before her death, whose alibis or behavior struck detectives as sufficiently suspicious to warrant sustained attention, though none were ever tied to the crime with evidence strong enough to secure charges. The apparent surgical skill evident in the body's mutilation led others to focus specifically on individuals with medical backgrounds, a line of inquiry that has persisted well beyond the original investigation and into decades of subsequent private research. Beyond these more grounded threads, the Black Dahlia case has, perhaps more than any other in this exploration, generated an enormous body of independent theorizing, some of it built on genuine archival research, some of it considerably more speculative. Several authors and researchers in later decades proposed specific named suspects, in certain cases connected to their own families, along with detailed reconstructions of the killer's movements and methods, though these theories remain contested, and none has achieved anything resembling consensus among historians or investigators who have reviewed the case with fresh eyes. The sheer publicity the murder received in 1947, meanwhile, produced dozens of false confessions in the years that followed. Individuals who claimed responsibility for reasons investigators generally attributed to notoriety rather than guilt, a phenomenon that further muddied an investigation already struggling under the weight of its own public profile. What remains unchanged, regardless of which theory one finds most persuasive, is the absence of resolution. The lot where Elizabeth Short was found has long since been built over, absorbed into the ordinary residential fabric of a neighborhood that has otherwise moved on entirely from the events of that January morning. Los Angeles Police Department case files on the murder remain officially open, a formality perhaps, but one that reflects an honest accounting of what was, and was not, ever established. Was Elizabeth Short's death the work of someone within the circles she moved through in her final weeks? A person whose name may already have crossed an investigator's desk in 1947 without ever accumulating sufficient proof? Or does the true answer lie somewhere the original investigation, however extensive, never thought to look? Nearly 8 decades on, the case endures less because of what is known about it, and more because of what was so carefully, so deliberately left unknown by whoever positioned Elizabeth Short in that quiet lot and walked away without ever being identified. Nearly 4 decades before Elizabeth Short was found in that Leimert Park lot, another American town had already been forced to confront a level of violence it had no framework for understanding. To reach it, we travel back to the summer of 1912, and to a small farming community in southwestern Iowa. Villisca, Iowa, at the turn of the 20th century was the kind of town where nothing much happened. A rural community built around agriculture, churches, and the quiet rhythms of small-town Midwestern life. It was in this setting, on the night of June 9, 1912, that the Moore family, Josiah, Sarah, and their 4 young children hosted 2 additional overnight guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, friends of the Moore children who had stayed after attending an evening church event. By morning, all 8 occupants of the house were dead, killed with an axe belonging to Josiah Moore himself, found left behind at the scene. A neighbor, growing concerned when the household failed to emerge that morning, discovered the crime and alerted authorities, setting into motion an investigation that would consume the small community for years, without ever producing a conviction that satisfied the available evidence. What investigators found inside the house was methodical, in a way that unsettled even experienced officers. Mirrors and glass surfaces in the home had been covered with clothing. A detail with no clear practical purpose, and a pan of bloody water sat on the kitchen counter, alongside a plate of uneaten food, as if the killer had paused, after the violence, to wash and to eat, in no apparent hurry to leave. The scene offered no obvious signs of robbery, no clear indication of forced entry beyond what a determined intruder could easily have managed, and, troublingly, no consistent physical evidence pointing toward any single suspect. The murder weapon, left at the scene rather than taken away, suggested either a killer indifferent to being identified through the weapon itself, or one who had never intended to be traced through conventional means in the first place. In the aftermath, Villisca's investigation unfolded in a manner that reflected both the limits of early 20th century forensic science and the desperate pressure a shaken community placed on local authorities to produce an answer. several suspects emerged over the following years. A traveling minister, known to have delivered a sermon in Villisca on the night of the murders, and to have a documented history of erratic and troubling behavior in other towns he passed through, was investigated extensively and tried twice, resulting in one hung jury and one acquittal, leaving his connection to the crime formally unresolved. A state legislator with a history of alleged inappropriate conduct toward children was also investigated, based partly on rumors regarding his relationship with the Moore family, though this line of inquiry, too, failed to produce evidence sufficient for prosecution. A private detective hired to investigate the case became convinced of the legislator's guilt and pursued the theory aggressively. But his methods, including alleged coercion of witnesses, ultimately undermined rather than strengthened the case against his preferred suspect. Beyond these two central figures, investigators at the time and researchers since have proposed a range of additional theories. Some point to a transient laborer known to travel the rail lines through the region, suggesting a pattern of similar axe murders in other small towns along the same railway routes in the years before and after the Villisca killings. A pattern that, if genuine, would suggest a single itinerant killer moving from town to town, striking families at random before disappearing again into the transportation networks of the era. This theory, sometimes referred to in connection with a specific named suspect, has never been conclusively proven, hampered by the same limitations that affected the original investigation: records lost, witnesses long deceased, and forensic techniques that simply did not exist in 1912 to test physical evidence against a suspect with any real precision. The stranger details of the scene, meanwhile, have generated their own body of speculation over the decades. The covered mirrors, in particular, have drawn considerable attention, some researchers reading them as an effort to prevent the killer from seeing his own reflection during the act, a superstition with folkloric roots that predates the case considerably, while others regard the detail as more likely a practical, if inexplicable, choice made by a disturbed mind, with no symbolic significance intended at all. The uneaten food and the basin of bloody water, too, have been read by some as evidence of a killer entirely unbothered by what he had done, calm enough afterward to attend to ordinary needs before departing. An interpretation that, if accurate, speaks to a level of psychological detachment that still troubles those who study the case. No suspect was ever convicted for the murders in the Moore house, and the case remains, formally, unsolved. The house itself still stands in Villisca today, restored to its 1912 condition and now open to the public, drawing visitors interested in a history that the town, for obvious reasons, has never been able to fully set aside. Locals who have spent time in the house over the years report a persistent unease within its rooms, though such accounts, as with so much of this case, remain impossible to verify by any conventional means. More than a century later, the questions that confronted investigators in the summer of 1912 remain essentially where they left them. Was the killer a local resident who managed to conceal his guilt for the remainder of his life, walking Villisca's streets unrecognized among people who had known the victims? Or did he arrive, as some have proposed, from entirely outside the town, striking without warning before continuing on toward some equally unsuspecting community, and vanishing into a period of American history that kept far poorer records than our own? The axe, we know. The hand that wielded it has never been named. Heat. A dry, shimmering heat, radiating up from pale sand under a cloudless summer sky, the particular heat of an Australian beach in late December, when families flock to the coast and children run ahead of their parents toward the water, certain, as children are, that nothing bad could possibly happen on such an ordinary day. Glenelg Beach, near Adelaide, South Australia, was exactly that kind of place on the morning of January 26, 1966, a popular, well-frequented stretch of coastline where local families gathered for the sun and the surf, comfortable enough in its familiarity that parents often allowed their children a degree of independence that, in later decades, would come to seem almost unthinkable. It was in this atmosphere of ordinary trust that Nancy Beaumont allowed her 3 children, Jane, aged 9, Arna, aged 7, and Grant, aged 4, to travel the short distance to Glenelg Beach alone that morning, as they had done on previous occasions, with instructions to return home by early afternoon. The children did not return. When Nancy Beaumont went looking for them later that day, she found no trace, setting into motion a disappearance that would become, and remains, one of Australia's most exhaustively investigated and enduringly unresolved cases. What made the Beaumont children's disappearance especially haunting was not an absence of witnesses, but rather an unusual abundance of them, each offering fragments that seemed, at first, to promise a resolution the case would ultimately never deliver. Several witnesses at Glenelg Beach that day reported seeing the 3 Beaumont children in the company of a tall, slim man with a deep tan, described as being in his 30s, who spent time with them on the beach and appeared, to those who noticed, to be someone the children were comfortable with rather than wary of. A local postman later reported having seen the children walking with a man matching this description later in the day, at some distance from the beach itself, moving in a direction away from their home. Other witnesses recalled the children buying pies and pastries at a local bakery, using money beyond what they had been given that morning, suggesting that whoever accompanied them had, at some point, provided them with additional funds, a detail that has never been satisfactorily explained. What these accounts offered, cumulatively, was the unsettling suggestion that the Beaumont children had not been the victims of some sudden, forceful abduction, but had instead spent much of that final day in the seemingly willing company of a stranger, one they apparently did not fear, and one who moved through a crowded public beach without attracting any suspicion strong enough to prevent what followed. Investigators at the time, and researchers since, have found this detail difficult to reconcile with any single, simple theory of the case. The subsequent investigation, one of the largest in South Australian history, produced an enormous volume of tips and possible sightings, none of which resolved into anything conclusive. In the years that followed, the man witnesses described has never been definitively identified. A prisoner named Arthur Stanley Brown was investigated based partly on his physical resemblance to witness descriptions and behavioral history involving children, though he died without any charges ever being filed in connection with the Beaumont case specifically. In more recent decades, attention has turned toward Harry Phipps, a wealthy Adelaide businessman who had, according to various accounts and family members who came forward later, exhibited behavior toward children that drew renewed scrutiny, along with connections to the Glenelg area during the relevant period. Excavations were even conducted decades later at a factory site associated with Phipps, based on information suggesting the children might have been buried there, though the searches ultimately produced no remains, leaving this theory, like every other, formally unresolved. Beyond these more grounded investigative threads, the Beaumont case has also drawn connections, debated but never confirmed, to a string of other child disappearances and murders in South Australia during the same general period, raising the difficult possibility that whoever took the Beaumont children may have continued to operate in the region for years afterward, targeting other families in ways authorities were never able to conclusively link back to a single individual. Some researchers regard these connections as compelling, pointing to broad similarities in circumstance and victim profile, while others urge caution, noting that South Australia's investigative techniques during this period were simply not equipped to establish forensic links strong enough to satisfy modern evidentiary standards. What is known, with certainty, is only the outline of that single day, 3 children last seen enjoying an ordinary beach outing, apparently comfortable in unfamiliar company, and then gone without remains ever recovered, without a name ever conclusively attached to their disappearance, and without the case file, still technically open nearly 6 decades later, ever closing the distance between what witnesses believed they saw and what can actually be proven. Nancy and Jim Beaumont spent the remainder of their lives in the same house, reportedly unable to bring themselves to leave, in case Jane, Arna, or Grant ever tried to find their way home. Both parents have since died without ever learning what became of their children. Glenelg Beach remains to this day a popular sunlit stretch of coastline, indistinguishable in most respects from any other Australian beach, its ordinary cheerfulness giving no indication of the day in 1966 when 3 children walked toward the water and, for reasons that have never been established, never walked back. A child, gone without explanation, and a community left to wonder for the rest of their lives. That particular grief has appeared more than once in this exploration already. It appears again here, though in a form stranger and, in some ways, even more difficult to comprehend. Not a child who disappeared, but a child no one ever seems to have been looking for at all. On February 25, 1957, in a wooded, semi-rural area of northeast Philadelphia known as Fox Chase, a college student walking along a stretch of road bordering the woods noticed a cardboard box discarded near a muskrat trap he had been checking. Believing it might contain discarded dolls, he approached and found instead the body of a young boy, roughly 4 to 6 years old, wrapped in a cheap flannel blanket inside a bassinet box that had once held a J.C. Penney baby crib. What followed would become one of the most extensively investigated and most stubbornly unresolved cases in the history of American law enforcement. The boy showed clear signs of prolonged abuse and neglect prior to his death, along with evidence of a final, fatal injury to the head. His body was notably thin, and his hair appeared to have been crudely cut, likely after death. Details that painted a picture of profound and sustained mistreatment before whatever final act ended his life. And yet, for all the physical evidence recovered at the scene, and for all the effort the Philadelphia Police Department poured into the case in the months and years that followed, one basic fact would prove impossible to establish. No one has ever been able to say, with confidence, who this child was. The scale of the investigation into his identity was, for its era, extraordinary. Police distributed hundreds of thousands of flyers bearing his photograph, sent officers to canvass orphanages, hospitals, and birth records across the region, and pursued tip after tip, hoping that someone, anyone, would recognize the boy. Investigators had, in the absence of a name, taken to calling simply the boy in the box, or, in a gesture toward the dignity his case seemed determined to withhold from him, America's unknown child. Despite this effort, and despite decades of renewed attention as forensic techniques advanced, his identity was never established through conventional means. The investigation turned up threads that seemed, at various points, close to a resolution, though none of them ever fully closed the case. In the early 1960s, a woman came forward claiming to have witnessed the boy's mother selling him to another woman years before his death, an account that generated significant interest but could never be corroborated with sufficient certainty to move the case forward. A bassinet, apparently identical to the one in which the boy had been found, was traced to a nearby thrift store, and investigators spent considerable effort attempting to identify the purchaser, an effort that ultimately reached its limits without producing a confirmed buyer. Homicide detectives across multiple decades maintained active interest in the case, some carrying it personally for the whole of their careers, a testament to how deeply the image of an unidentified, uncared-for child could settle into the conscience of those who investigated it. In 1998, the boy's remains were exhumed, and DNA was successfully extracted and preserved for future comparison, a development that offered new hope as genetic genealogy techniques advanced in the years that followed. In 2022, using forensic genetic genealogy methods similar to those that had identified the Somerton Man in Australia, investigators finally succeeded in establishing his name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. This identification, achieved 65 years after his body was found, resolved the question that had defined the case for generations, but it has not resolved the deeper, more troubling questions that surrounded his death from the very beginning. Who was responsible for the abuse Joseph endured before his death, and for the injury that ultimately killed him? Why did no relative, no neighbor, no institution ever report a missing child matching his description, despite the extraordinary publicity the case received during the original investigation? Was his identity deliberately concealed by those responsible for his care, in a manner methodical enough to withstand decades of dedicated police work? Philadelphia investigators, even with a name now attached to the case, have continued to pursue answers to these questions, treating the matter as an open homicide investigation rather than a resolved one. What makes the case linger, perhaps more than any single detail of the crime itself, is the sheer disproportion between the effort expended trying to identify one small boy and the apparent absence of anyone in his own life willing to acknowledge that he was missing at all. Somewhere, in the years before 1957, Joseph Zarelli existed within a family, a household, a set of relationships that failed him so completely that even his death did not prompt anyone to come forward. Investigators have often noted that this may be the case's most unsettling, unresolved element, not the mechanics of how he died, but the silence that surrounded him both before and after. His grave, marked today with his name, rather than the anonymous designation under which he was buried in 1957, still receives visitors, drawn by a case that spent 65 years defined by absence. The name has finally been given back to him. Whether the truth of what happened to him, and who among the living once knew his name and said nothing, will ever surface, in turn remains, even now, an open question the city of Philadelphia has never stopped asking. There is a particular kind of dread that comes not from a body left in a box, or a family vanished from a home, but from a mailbox, an ordinary, everyday object, opened on an ordinary afternoon, that turns out to contain something meant only for you. It is worth pausing to consider how mundane the vessel for terror can be. Sometimes it is not a weapon or a scene or a missing person at all. Sometimes it is simply paper and ink and a stranger who knows far more about your life than they ever should. Circleville, Ohio, in the late 1970s was a small, unremarkable town in Pickaway County, the kind of place built around close-knit families, modest homes, and the assumption, common to towns of its size, that everyone more or less knew everyone else's business, and that whatever secrets existed were, on some level, shared secrets, known if not spoken aloud. It was this assumption that would be shattered, repeatedly and with escalating menace, by a series of anonymous letters that began arriving in local mailboxes starting in 1976, and that would, over the following years, entangle an entire family in a mystery Circleville has never fully put to rest. The letters were addressed most directly to Mary Gillespie, a bus driver in the local school district, and their contents made a specific and explosive allegation that Mary was engaged in an affair with Gordon Massey, the superintendent of the school district where she worked. The author, who signed nothing and left no return address, seemed to know an unsettling amount about Mary's private life and daily movements, details that suggested someone with genuine proximity to her, rather than a stranger working from rumor alone. The letters did not stop with Mary. Her husband, Ron Gillespie, also began receiving similarly detailed accusatory mail, adding a second front to a situation that was already, for the family, deeply distressing. What happened next elevated the case from an unpleasant but containable domestic matter into something considerably darker. On August 19, 1977, Ron Gillespie left his home after receiving another anonymous call, reportedly intending to confront whoever was responsible for the letters that had been tormenting his family. He was found dead a short time later. His truck crashed near the property of Gordon Massey, the very man named in the letters as Mary's alleged lover. The official cause of his death was ruled an accident, the result of the crash itself, though the circumstances surrounding his final hours, the phone call, the destination, the timing, have never sat comfortably with everyone who has examined the case since. Rather than ending with Ron's death, the letters continued, now seeming to reference the accident directly, and expanding their scope to include the broader Gillespie and Massey families, along with, at various points, other residents of Circleville who found themselves unexpectedly drawn into a controversy they had no part in creating. The volume was substantial. Investigators would later estimate that thousands of these anonymous letters had been sent over the following years, typewritten, carefully worded, and seemingly always aware of developments in the lives of their recipients almost as soon as those developments occurred. An awareness that fed a growing sense within the community that the author was not some distant crank, but someone embedded, quite literally, among them. In 1983, several years after the letters began, Mary Gillespie discovered a sign posted near a local roadway, one that referenced her directly, and appeared to be part of the same campaign of harassment that had plagued her family for years. Suspecting the sign might be connected to a booby-trapped mechanism, given threats she had received, local authorities investigated and discovered a homemade device rigged to the sign, seemingly intended to injure or kill whoever attempted to remove it. This escalation, from anonymous letters to what investigators treated as an attempted act of violence, brought the case to a new level of seriousness and led, eventually, to an arrest. Paul Freshour, Mary Gillespie's brother-in-law, was charged in connection with the booby trap, and based largely on handwriting analysis connecting him to the letters, was ultimately convicted and sentenced to prison. It seemed, for a moment, as though Circleville's long ordeal might have reached a resolution, and yet what followed did nothing to settle the matter definitively. While Freshour was incarcerated, and under conditions that made it exceptionally difficult for him to have personally mailed anything, letters matching the same style and preoccupations as the earlier correspondence continued to arrive in Circleville, raising an uncomfortable question that has never been adequately answered. If Freshour was truly responsible for the entire letter-writing campaign, how could the letters have continued, seemingly uninterrupted, while he sat in prison under supervision, with limited access to the outside world? Freshour himself maintained his innocence for the rest of his life, arguing that he had been wrongfully convicted and pointing to the continuation of the letters during his imprisonment as evidence that the true author had never been identified. He was released on parole in 1994, having served over a decade in prison, and he continued to assert his innocence until his death in 2012, always maintaining that the real writer, or writers, had been allowed to remain anonymous while he bore the legal consequences of a case built on evidence he considered circumstantial. The mainstream account of the Circleville letters, then, centers on Freshour as the culprit, supported by the handwriting analysis that led to his conviction, and by a general theory that whatever letters arrived during his imprisonment might have been the work of a copycat, inspired by a case that had, by then, become notorious across the region, or possibly composed by an accomplice acting on Freshour's behalf, someone within his circle willing to continue the harassment in his name. This explanation accounts for at least part of the case's stranger continuity, while still leaving Freshour as the primary, if not sole, author of the original campaign. Others who have studied the case more skeptically have questioned whether the evidence against Freshour was ever strong enough to support the certainty of his conviction, noting that handwriting analysis, while treated seriously by the courts of the period, has since faced considerable scrutiny regarding its reliability as forensic evidence, particularly in cases where a typewriter, rather than handwriting itself, was the primary medium in question. Under this reading, the letters in the booby trap device may represent the work of an entirely different individual, someone within the extended community of Circleville who possessed the same intimate knowledge of the Gillespie and Massey families' private lives, and who allowed Freshour to serve as a convenient, socially proximate suspect, while the true author faded quietly back into the ordinary rhythms of small-town life, never suspected, never investigated further. Still, others have focused on the sheer scale and duration of the letter-writing campaign itself as the case's most genuinely unresolved element, regardless of who authored any specific piece of correspondence. Thousands of letters, sustained across years, referencing private details, evolving alongside real events in real time, represent an extraordinary level of commitment and access that few individuals, guilty or innocent, could easily sustain alone. Some researchers have wondered whether the case may have involved more than one person from the outset, a possibility that would help explain both the volume of correspondence and its uninterrupted continuation during Freshour's incarceration, though no evidence has ever definitively identified a second author, or clarified what relationship, if any, that person might have had to Freshour himself. What remains constant across every version of this story is the unresolved tension between conviction and continuation, a man found guilty by a court, and letters that, by the accounts of those who received them, did not stop simply because he had been removed from the outside world. Ron Gillespie's death, ruled accidental, continues to sit uneasily within a case defined by menace and calculation, and Mary Gillespie, who bore the brunt of the letters for years, was left, like so many at the center of these cases, with a resolution that answered some questions while leaving others permanently suspended. Circleville today looks much as any small Ohio town does, its roads and homes indistinguishable from thousands of similar communities across the Midwest. But somewhere in its history remains an author, or perhaps more than one, whose full identity, motive, and relationship to the events of 1976 through the following decades has never been conclusively established. Was Paul Freshour truly the man behind years of calculated harassment, convicted correctly despite the questions his case has raised? Or did Circleville's real letter writer simply watch, from somewhere close enough to know everything, as someone else was made to answer for it? Whatever knowledge sat behind those thousands of anonymous pages has, so far, stayed exactly where its author intended: hidden, patient, and never fully brought into the light. East now, and north, away from the flat farmland of Ohio, and into the folded forested mountains of southern Vermont, where the Green Mountain National Forest rises in dense stands of maple and pine, and where a stretch of wilderness between the towns of Woodford and Glastonbury has, for the better part of a century, accumulated a reputation few places in New England can match. The area now commonly referred to as the Bennington Triangle is not an officially designated region, but rather a loosely bounded area of wilderness in southwestern Vermont centered on Glastonbury Mountain that became associated over a span of years in the mid-20th century with a startling concentration of disappearances, each distinct, each investigated on its own terms, and each ultimately left unresolved. Glastonbury itself had been, by the early 20th century, largely abandoned as a town, its logging and industrial ventures having failed, leaving behind a landscape that had begun reverting to wilderness even as hikers and outdoorsmen continued to pass through it. it was against this backdrop, already somewhat unusual for a region so close to established towns, that the disappearances began. The most frequently cited cluster occurred between November 1945 and October 1950, a span of roughly 5 years, during which 5 individuals vanished from the same general area under circumstances that, examined individually, might each be explained by the ordinary hazards of wilderness terrain, but that, taken together, have struck many who study the case as a pattern too concentrated to dismiss easily. In November 1945, Mitty Rivers, an experienced local guide, was leading a group of hunters back from a trip on Glastonbury Mountain when he moved ahead of the group and was never seen again. Extensive search efforts turned up nothing beyond a single isolated discovery, one of his rifle cartridges, found later at a stream crossing, but no further trace of a man who, by every account, possessed exactly the wilderness skills one would expect to prevent precisely this kind of disappearance. Less than a year later, in December 1946, Paula Weldon, an 18-year-old college student at nearby Bennington College, set out for a solitary hike on a section of the long trail that crossed through the same general area. She was seen briefly by other hikers on the trail before she moved ahead of them and vanished in daylight, along a well-established path, without any of the physical evidence, footprints, discarded items, or eyewitness sightings that investigators would ordinarily expect even a compromised search to eventually turn up. Her case, more than any other in the cluster, drew significant regional and national attention at the time, in part because of how completely she seemed to disappear from a location that offered searchers so little terrain in which to lose a trail. In 1950, the pattern continued. Paul Jepson, an 8-year-old boy, was left briefly unattended by his mother, who worked at a farm dump in the area, and disappeared within a very short window of time, a matter of a few hours at most, despite the immediate initiation of a search once his absence was noticed. Later that same year, Frida Langer, a hiker familiar with the local terrain, became separated briefly from a hiking companion during a walk near the Somerset Reservoir, an area within the broader Glastonbury region, and also failed to return. Her case differed from the others in one significant respect. Her remains were eventually discovered several months later in an area that had reportedly already been searched extensively, raising its own quiet question about how a body could have gone unnoticed during earlier, thorough search efforts, only to be found later in the same general location. Taken as a group, these disappearances, alongside a small number of other reported incidents in the surrounding years, are what gave rise to the name Bennington Triangle, a term coined decades later by researchers drawing a deliberate comparison to the more famous Bermuda Triangle, in an effort to capture the sense that this particular stretch of Vermont wilderness had, for a defined period, exhibited a rate of unresolved disappearance well beyond what the region's population and hiking traffic would ordinarily predict. The most grounded explanations for the cluster point to the genuinely hazardous character of the terrain itself. Glastonbury Mountain and its surrounding wilderness feature dense forest cover, uneven and easily disorienting terrain, old mine shafts and industrial remnants left over from the area's abandoned logging operations, and a climate capable of shifting rapidly, particularly in the higher elevations, where sudden cold, fog, or precipitation could quickly compromise even an experienced hiker's sense of direction. Search and rescue officials, both at the time and in later reviews of the cluster, have generally favored this explanation, one that treats each disappearance as tragic but individually explicable, a byproduct of difficult, remote terrain that has claimed lives elsewhere in New England under broadly similar circumstances, without requiring any connecting thread beyond geography and misfortune. This explanation, however reasonable, has never fully satisfied everyone who has examined the case closely, largely because of details that resist easy absorption into a narrative of simple misadventure. Mitty Rivers's expertise as a guide sits uneasily within an account that assumes ordinary disorientation. Paula Weldon's disappearance from a well-traveled trail in daylight, without any physical trace recovered despite an extensive search, has struck many investigators as difficult to reconcile purely with the terrain and weather. And Frida Langer's remains, surfacing months later in ground that had reportedly already been covered by searchers, has never been explained in a way that fully accounts for how such a discovery could have been missed the first time. In the absence of full satisfaction with the conventional explanation, other theories have taken root over the decades, ranging from the folkloric to the considerably more speculative. Long before the disappearances of the 1940s and 50s, the region already carried a body of indigenous folklore associated with Glastonbury Mountain, including accounts describing the area as a place where the ground itself was considered unsafe or spiritually unsettled. And some later researchers have drawn on this older folklore as a framework for understanding the later disappearances, suggesting a continuity between older beliefs about the mountain and the modern cluster of vanishings, without ever proposing a specific mechanism that could account for it in more concrete terms. Others have proposed the presence of a large, unidentified animal inhabiting the deeper, less accessible sections of the forest, drawing on a long tradition of reported cryptid sightings across the broader northeastern United States, while still others have speculated, in the case's most fringe interpretations, about the possibility of some kind of unexplained natural phenomenon specific to the geology of the area, capable of disorienting or otherwise affecting those who ventured too far into its interior. None of these theories have produced evidence that mainstream researchers regard as compelling, and each remains, by its nature, essentially unfalsifiable, a fact that has not diminished their persistence in the decades since the cluster of disappearances first drew public attention. What is beyond dispute is the timeline itself. 5 individuals, each with different circumstances, different levels of wilderness experience, and different immediate causes for their presence in the area, vanished from a relatively small stretch of Vermont wilderness within the span of 5 years, and only one of them was ever found. Glastonbury Mountain today remains part of the Green Mountain National Forest, still hiked, still logged in limited capacity, still largely indistinguishable to the casual visitor from any other stretch of dense New England woodland. And yet, for those who know its history, the question persists quietly beneath the canopy. Was this simply an unfortunate concentration of ordinary tragedy, the ordinary price of difficult terrain paid 5 times over in a short span of years? Or does Glastonbury Mountain hold something in its ground, or in the memory embedded in its older folklore, that has never been adequately explained, and that has, since 1950, simply gone quiet, waiting, perhaps, for the next disappearance no one can yet predict? Smoke, and then flame, rising fast against a black December sky, visible for miles across a valley, and utterly unstoppable by the time anyone realized what was happening. It is one of the few sounds and sights in this entire exploration that half a town witnessed directly, in real time, and yet the questions it left behind have proven no easier to answer than any mystery unfolding in silence and isolation. Fayetteville, West Virginia, in the years following the Second World War, was a small Appalachian town built around coal, timber, and the tight-knit immigrant communities that had settled the region in the decades before. George and Jenny Sodder, an Italian immigrant couple, had built a life there with their large family, 10 children in all, and a modest, comfortable home on the edge of town that reflected years of hard work and steady prosperity. On the night of December 24, 1945, that home would be destroyed by fire, and 5 of the Sodder children would be presumed to have died within it, though what actually happened to them has never, to this day, been definitively established. The fire began in the early hours of December 25th, after the family had gone to bed following an ordinary Christmas Eve. Jenny Sodder was awakened by a phone call from an unfamiliar voice asking for someone who did not live at the residence, an odd, seemingly misdialed call that some later scrutiny would treat as potentially significant, given what followed. Sometime after returning to bed, Jenny became aware of the smell of smoke and discovered the house engulfed in flame with alarming speed. George and several of the older children, along with Jenny, managed to escape, but 5 of the younger children, Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, ranging in age from 5 to 14, could not be reached, trapped upstairs as the fire spread with a speed that struck several family members, even in their panic, as unusual. George Sodder attempted repeatedly to reach the upper floor to rescue the children, and when this proved impossible, he tried to use a ladder normally kept against the side of the house, only to find it missing from its usual place, eventually discovered a considerable distance away, in a location that made no obvious sense for an object rarely moved. He then attempted to start one of the family's trucks in hopes of using it to reach the windows, only to find that neither vehicle would start, despite both having been in working order the day before. By the time neighbors arrived to help, the house was already lost, and firefighters, delayed reportedly by difficulty reaching the volunteer fire chief and by the rural nature of the area's telephone and transportation infrastructure, did not arrive at the scene until hours after the fire had fully consumed the structure. In the fire's aftermath, officials conducted only a limited search of the wreckage before concluding that the 5 missing children had died in the blaze, attributing the absence of recovered remains to the intensity of the fire, hot enough, in their assessment, to have completely cremated the bodies within the time available. This conclusion, delivered relatively quickly and without what many later observers considered a sufficiently thorough excavation of the site, would become the first and most persistent source of doubt in a case that George and Jenny Sodder refused to accept as closed for the remainder of their lives. The Sodders' skepticism was not simply the understandable denial of grieving parents. It was grounded in a specific, accumulating set of physical details that resisted easy explanation. A later, independent examination of the fire's likely temperature and duration, conducted at the family's request, suggested that a blaze intense enough to have completely cremated 5 children's remains, leaving nothing recoverable, would have required conditions considerably more extreme and considerably longer in duration than what witnesses described that night, raising the question of where the remains had actually gone, if not consumed entirely within the house. Adding to the family's doubts, a state highway inspector reportedly told them of having seen the children, alive, watching the fire from along the roadside as it burned, and, while this account was never conclusively verified, it fed into the family's suspicion that some or all of the children may have survived the night, only to disappear afterward under entirely different circumstances. Other details compounded the mystery further. The severed telephone line at the house, discovered cut rather than simply damaged by fire, suggested to the family that someone may have deliberately isolated the house from outside communication before the blaze began. The missing ladder and the 2 disabled vehicles suggested, at minimum, an unusual confluence of obstacles specifically preventing rescue. Obstacles that a family already suspicious of foul play interpreted as evidence of deliberate sabotage rather than coincidence. George Sodder had, in the period before the fire, reportedly clashed with some members of the local community over political disagreements tied to his outspoken criticism of Mussolini's Italy, a stance that had, by some accounts, generated hostility from a small number of local Sicilian immigrants sympathetic to the fascist government, and this tension became, for the family, a plausible motive underlying a fire they had come to believe was set deliberately, possibly in connection with an earlier act of arson threatened against the family for reasons tied to this same political conflict. The Sodders spent decades pursuing their own investigation, at considerable personal and financial cost, erecting a billboard along the highway near Fayetteville, bearing photographs of the 5 missing children and offering a reward for information. A billboard that stood for years as a visible, public assertion that the official account of the fire had never been sufficient. They received, over time, a number of letters and tips suggesting sightings of children who might have matched their missing family members, including one photograph, sent anonymously in the 1960s, of a young man the family believed strongly resembled their son Louis as he might have appeared in adulthood, though this lead, like every other the family pursued, was never conclusively confirmed or connected to their case. The mainstream account of the Sodder fire holds that it was a tragic, accidental house fire, likely originating from faulty wiring, a known issue the family had reportedly experienced in the period before the blaze, and that the missing remains reflect the genuine limitations of 1945-era fire investigation rather than evidence of any deliberate cover-up or survival. This explanation accounts for the fire itself in straightforward terms, while leaving considerably less room to explain the missing ladder, the disabled vehicles, the severed phone line, and the numerous reported sightings that followed in the fire's aftermath. Details that the official investigation, closed relatively quickly, never fully addressed to the family's satisfaction. Alternative theories, championed by the family for the remainder of their lives, center on deliberate arson connected to George Sodder's political conflicts, potentially undertaken with the specific intent to abduct rather than kill the children, an interpretation that would explain both the apparent absence of remains and the reported sightings of children matching their descriptions in the years that followed. Though it requires accepting a scenario, kidnapping disguised as a house fire, that official investigators at the time, and many researchers since, have considered difficult to substantiate without more direct evidence. George Sodder died in 1969, and Jenny in 1989, neither having recovered their children's remains, nor received an explanation they considered adequate for the details that troubled them from the very first night. The billboard they erected stood along the West Virginia highway for years, a public, unresolved question posed to anyone who passed. Was the Sodder fire simply an accident, tragic in its scale but explicable within the ordinary hazards of rural 1940s housing, or did 5 children survive that Christmas Eve blaze, taken rather than killed, their fates deliberately obscured by someone with reason enough to want George Sodder's family destroyed? 8 decades on, the fire has long since faded from the landscape, but the question the Sodders spent their lives asking has never been given an answer either side of the argument could call complete. From the wooded hills of Appalachia, the story now crosses an ocean to a small regional airport on the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria, and to a bank of grainy security camera footage that would become nearly the entirety of what the world would ever know about the final hours of a young German man named Lars Mittank. Burgas Airport, in the summer of 2014, was a modest, functional facility serving the tourists who flocked each year to Bulgaria's Black Sea resorts. A place of check-in counters, departure gates, and the low hum of vacationers moving through security with beach bags and sunburns rather than any expectation of danger. It was through this airport, on the morning of June 8, 2014, that 28-year-old Lars Mittank was scheduled to fly home to Germany after a holiday in the resort town of Sunny Beach with a group of friends. He never boarded that flight, and in the years since, investigators, journalists, and independent researchers have pieced together, almost entirely from security camera footage, an account of his final movements that raises considerably more questions than it resolves. In the days leading up to his disappearance, Mittank had been involved in an altercation at a nightclub in Sunny Beach, during which he sustained an injury to his ear reportedly requiring medical attention. Friends who had traveled with him described him as anxious and increasingly paranoid in the period following this incident, behavior some attributed to the psychological aftermath of the altercation, and others later wondered might have reflected something more specific, a genuine fear of being targeted or followed, whether justified or not. On the morning of his scheduled flight, airport security footage shows Mittank behaving in a manner his friends and family found deeply out of character. He appeared visibly agitated, repeatedly looking behind him as though watching for someone, and at one point walked away from the security checkpoint entirely, moving quickly through the terminal in a way that suggested urgency, even panic, though the footage offers no visible indication of what, specifically, might have prompted this reaction. No pursuer is visible in the frame. No confrontation appears on camera. And yet Mittank's body language, captured across multiple angles as he moved through the airport, reads unmistakably as the behavior of a man convinced he was in danger. What followed, reconstructed largely through subsequent footage and witness accounts gathered by his family in the years after his disappearance, only deepens the mystery. Mittank left the airport on foot, still exhibiting signs of distress, and was later seen on footage from nearby locations, including, according to some accounts, jumping over a fence in what appeared to be a continued effort to evade someone or something. He was reportedly seen requesting help from local residents, in a state friends who reviewed the footage described as frightened, disoriented, and increasingly desperate, before he vanished from any further recorded sighting near a wooded, semi-rural area outside the town. No trace of him has been found since. No remains, no confirmed sighting, no communication of any kind has reached his family or Bulgarian authorities in the years that have followed his disappearance. The investigation into Mittank's case has been complicated, from its earliest stages by jurisdictional and procedural difficulties that his family has publicly and repeatedly criticized. Bulgarian authorities, according to the family's account, were slow to treat the case with the urgency they believed it warranted, and Mittank's mother, Jane Mittank, has spent years conducting her own parallel investigation, traveling to Bulgaria repeatedly, gathering footage and witness testimony independently, and pursuing leads that she has argued official channels failed to adequately follow. This gap between official and independent investigation has left the case in an unusual position. A great deal of raw material exists, footage, testimony, physical geography that has been mapped and remapped by those searching for him, and yet none of it has converged into an accepted account of what actually happened to Lars Mittank after he disappeared from camera range outside Sunny Beach. The most commonly proposed mainstream theory holds that Mittank, in a state of genuine psychological distress, whether triggered by the nightclub altercation, an undiagnosed medical or mental health crisis, or some combination of both, became disoriented and paranoid to a degree that led him into dangerous, unfamiliar terrain, where he may have suffered an accident, succumbed to exposure, or otherwise met a fate that, while tragic, would not necessarily involve any third party at all. Under this reading, the visible fear captured on airport footage reflects a genuine internal crisis rather than a response to any real external threat, and his subsequent disappearance, however striking the footage may appear, is ultimately explicable through the lens of a medical or psychological emergency, compounded by unfamiliar, isolated surroundings. This explanation, however, has never fully satisfied Mittank's family or the considerable number of independent researchers who have examined the case closely, in part because his behavior on camera, viewed by many who have studied the footage, reads less like confusion and more like a specific, targeted fear, the behavior of someone actively watching for a particular threat rather than someone disoriented by internal crisis alone. This reading has given rise to a persistent alternative theory. that the nightclub altercation in the days before his disappearance was not a random incident but was connected to something more serious: organized crime activity in the resort area, an assault or threat serious enough that Mittank believed, correctly or not, that his life remained in danger even after leaving the club, and that his flight through the airport and into the surrounding countryside reflected a genuine attempt to escape individuals who may have continued pursuing him, out of frame, throughout the footage that has been so extensively reviewed. Sunny Beach and the broader Bulgarian Black Sea coast has a documented history of organized criminal activity connected to its tourism economy, a detail that has lent this theory a degree of plausibility beyond pure speculation, though no direct evidence has ever definitively connected any specific individual or organization to Mittank's disappearance. Still others, working from the same limited footage, have proposed even more specific theories involving trafficking or abduction, scenarios that would explain both his evident fear and the total absence of any subsequent trace, though these theories, like the organized crime theory more broadly, remain fundamentally unconfirmed, resting on inference from behavior rather than direct evidence of what occurred once Mittank passed beyond the reach of any camera. What makes this case distinct from many others in this exploration is the unusual abundance of visual evidence paired with a near-total absence of resolution. We can watch Lars Mittank move through an airport terminal, watch him glance repeatedly over his shoulder, watch him scale a fence in what appears to be genuine flight, and yet none of this footage, extensively analyzed as it has been, tells us who or what he believed was pursuing him, or what ultimately became of him once he moved beyond the last camera's range. His mother continues to search over a decade later, convinced that someone, somewhere along Bulgaria's Black Sea coast, knows considerably more than has ever been shared with either her or the authorities nominally responsible for the case. Was Lars Mittank failed by his own mind on that June morning, undone by a crisis no camera could fully explain? Or did the fear so visible on that airport footage reflect something real, something that has never been named, and that continues, even now, to keep its silence somewhere along the coastline where he was last seen? Footage. In the Mittank case, it was security cameras, silent witnesses recording a man's fear without ever explaining its cause. In this next case, the screen itself becomes the mystery, no longer a passive witness to strange behavior, but the very instrument through which something inexplicable intruded into ordinary American living rooms. Chicago, Illinois, on the evening of November 22, 1987, was an unremarkable Sunday like any other. Television sets tuned across the city to their usual programming, audiences settling in for the evening news or the science fiction adventure that would follow it. At WGN-TV, during the sportscast that night, something happened that engineers and broadcast historians still struggle to fully explain nearly 4 decades later. For a matter of seconds, the station's signal was hijacked, replaced by the image of a person wearing a mask modeled after Max Headroom, a popular satirical television character of the era, distorted by a swaying, deliberately unstable video effect meant to mimic the character's signature visual style. WGN engineers, moving quickly, managed to switch to a different frequency and restore their broadcast within moments, an intrusion so brief that many viewers may not have registered anything unusual at all. What happened roughly 2 hours later, however, was impossible to dismiss so easily. During a broadcast of the science fiction series Doctor Who on WTTTW, Chicago's public television station, the same masked figure appeared again, this time for a considerably longer, more disturbing duration, nearly 90 seconds, during which the intruder engaged in a range of bizarre behavior that included distorted, hard-to-parse speech, mocking gestures directed at a rival broadcaster, and, toward the end of the segment, an incident in which the figure appeared to be struck with a fly swatter by an unseen second person, before the intrusion continued with the masked figure, partially disrobed, delivering further garbled, unsettling remarks before the broadcast finally cut away and WTTW's normal programming resumed. The technical accomplishment underlying this second intrusion is, even now, treated by broadcast engineers as genuinely remarkable, and considerably more difficult to explain than the brief WGN interruption that preceded it. WTTW's signal was being transmitted from an antenna position that made hijacking it substantially more technically demanding than intercepting a standard studio broadcast, requiring, according to engineers who later reviewed the case, a signal considerably more powerful than WTTW's own, along with equipment and technical knowledge well beyond that of a casual hobbyist. Whoever was responsible needed not only the specialized broadcast equipment necessary to override a professional signal, but also a level of understanding of Chicago's specific broadcast infrastructure, sufficient to target two separate stations within the same evening, a detail that has led many investigators, then and since, to suspect the involvement of someone with genuine professional or technical experience within the broadcast industry itself. The Federal Communications Commission and the FBI both opened investigations into the incident, treating it appropriately as a serious federal offense, the unauthorized hijacking of a licensed broadcast signal being a violation with real legal consequences. And yet, despite the seriousness of the investigation and the relatively narrow window of technical expertise required to pull off such an intrusion, no individual or group was ever definitively identified as responsible. No arrests were made, no confession, credible or otherwise, has ever been authenticated as connected to the incident. The case formally remains unsolved, an active piece of American broadcast history whose central question, who was behind the mask, has never been answered by any official investigative body. In the years following the intrusion, a number of explanations have circulated, ranging from the plausible to the highly speculative. The most grounded theories point toward disgruntled or thrill-seeking individuals within the broadcast or technical engineering community, people with legitimate professional access to the kind of equipment necessary to pull off the hijacking, motivated perhaps by a desire to demonstrate a vulnerability in the broadcast system, or simply by the appeal of an elaborate, anonymous prank targeting an industry they knew intimately. This explanation accounts reasonably well for the technical sophistication involved, while still leaving considerable room for uncertainty regarding motive, specific identity, and the strange, almost theatrical content of the broadcast itself. Others have focused more specifically on the content of the intrusion, noting that the masked figure's remarks, however garbled and difficult to parse, seem to reference specific individuals and institutions within Chicago's broadcast and media landscape, suggesting a targeted grievance rather than a random act of technical mischief. Under this reading, the intrusion represents a deliberate, personal statement directed at someone within the industry, disguised behind the Max Headroom mask precisely because the perpetrator wished to be understood by a specific, narrow audience, even while remaining anonymous to the broader public watching at home. A small number of individuals have, over the decades, come forward claiming knowledge of or involvement in the incident, though none of these claims has ever been corroborated with evidence sufficient to satisfy investigators or independent researchers who have examined the case closely. This pattern, an event notorious enough to attract false or unverifiable claims of responsibility, echoes, in its own way, the experience of investigators in several of the cases already explored in this series, cases where notoriety itself seems to generate a kind of noise that makes genuine signal, if it exists at all, considerably harder to isolate. Beyond these more grounded theories, the Max Headroom intrusion has, inevitably, attracted its share of more speculative interpretation in the years since. some viewing the incident through the lens of broader anxieties about media manipulation and the vulnerability of broadcast infrastructure to unauthorized control. Anxieties that feel, if anything, more resonant in the decades since 1987 than they did at the time. Others have focused on the sheer strangeness of the performance itself, the mask, the deliberately unstable visual effect, the seemingly improvised, unsettling behavior captured in that nearly 90-second window, as evidence of something more elaborately staged than a simple prank, though what larger purpose such staging might have served has never been convincingly established by anyone claiming to understand the intrusion's true intent. What remains, nearly 4 decades later, is the footage itself, preserved and endlessly re-examined by broadcast historians, technical engineers, and casual researchers drawn to a mystery that combines genuine technical sophistication with an atmosphere of deliberate, almost theatrical strangeness rarely matched by other unsolved cases of the era. The FCC's case file, like so many others explored in this series, remains formally unresolved. No one has ever been named. No motive has ever been confirmed. And the central image at the center of it all, a masked figure swaying against a distorted backdrop, delivering fragments of meaning that resist full interpretation even after decades of study, continues to raise the same question it did the moment it first appeared on Chicago television screens in November 1987. Who was behind that mask, and what, if anything, were they actually trying to say to the city watching them? 9 years would pass before the questions raised over Chicago's airwaves found an unlikely echo, not in another broadcast, but falling quite literally from the sky, over a small town on the shore of Lake Ontario. Oakville, Ontario, on the morning of August 18, 1994, was a quiet suburban community northwest of Toronto. Its streets and yards ordinary in every visible respect, the kind of place where residents expected nothing more unusual on a summer morning than the routine business of lawns and errands. What they got instead, in the early hours of that day, was a substance falling from the sky in small, gelatinous globs, later widely referred to as the Oakville Blobs, an event that would draw the attention of environmental officials, journalists, and eventually a considerable body of independent researchers, none of whom have ever produced a fully satisfying account of exactly what fell on the town that morning, or why. Residents across a fairly wide area reported the same basic phenomenon: a jelly-like substance, translucent or slightly discolored, landing on lawns, cars, and outdoor surfaces, in some cases in quantities substantial enough to be immediately noticeable rather than dismissed as an incidental curiosity. What set the incident apart from an ordinary, easily explained environmental event was the reaction the substance provoked in a small number of residents who came into direct contact with it. Several individuals who touched the material reported symptoms in the hours that followed, including flu-like illness, fever, and general malaise serious enough that some sought medical attention. A detail that transformed what might otherwise have been treated as a strange but harmless curiosity into a matter of genuine public health concern. Environmental and health authorities responded relatively quickly, collecting samples of the substance for laboratory analysis in an effort to determine both its composition and its origin. Early testing indicated the presence of biological material consistent with human or animal waste, along with bacteria, findings that led officials to a working theory involving aircraft. Specifically, that the substance may have originated from a plane's holding tank, either through an accidental or improperly managed release, with the material breaking apart and falling across a wide area as it descended through the atmosphere. This explanation, while not entirely satisfying to everyone who examined the case, offered at least a plausible mechanism for how a biological substance might fall from the sky across a defined geographic area on a single morning, and it became, in official accounts, the leading theory associated with the incident. And yet, even accepting this general framework, aspects of the case have continued to resist full resolution. No airline, private aircraft operator, or aviation authority was ever definitively linked to the substance, and no flight path or specific aircraft was ever confirmed as the source, leaving the waste tank theory technically plausible, but never conclusively proven through direct evidence connecting it to any actual flight over Oakville that morning. Some later analyses of the material also noted characteristics that fit awkwardly with a simple explanation involving standard aircraft waste, findings that different researchers examining the case have interpreted in different ways, some regarding them as consistent with contamination or degradation of the sample during collection and testing. Others treating them as evidence that the substance's true origin may never have been fully or accurately determined. This gap between the officially favored explanation and the residual uncertainty surrounding the sample's precise composition opened space for a range of alternative theories in the years following the incident, some grounded in reasonable extensions of known science, others considerably more speculative. Among the more grounded alternative explanations, some researchers have proposed a biological origin entirely disconnected from aviation, suggesting that the substance may have resulted from a bloom or mass release of a naturally occurring organism, potentially algal or fungal in nature, dispersed by unusual atmospheric conditions in a manner that produced the observed effect of a substance falling from the sky over a defined area. Though this theory, like the aircraft waste theory before it, has never been definitively proven, largely due to the same limitations that hampered the original 1994 investigation. Samples collected under less than ideal conditions, testing technology that has since advanced considerably, and a substance that, by its nature, appears to have degraded quickly enough that later, more sophisticated analysis was never able to fully revisit the original material with the same forensic rigor a modern investigation might apply. Other theories, drifting further from the mainstream explanations favored by the officials who originally investigated the case, have proposed connections to military or industrial testing, suggesting that some unacknowledged experimental process, whether related to atmospheric research, chemical testing, or another form of undisclosed activity, might account for a substance that fell in a pattern and concentration difficult to fully explain through either the aircraft waste theory or a natural biological bloom. Proponents of this line of thinking often point to the symptoms reported by residents who came into direct contact with the material as evidence that the substance possessed properties inconsistent with either ordinary human or animal waste or a naturally occurring biological organism, though, as with the aviation and biological bloom theories before it, this explanation has never been substantiated through evidence strong enough to move it from speculation into an accepted account of the incident. At the furthest edge of the case's theorizing, a smaller number of researchers and enthusiasts have situated the Oakville Blobs within a broader category of reported sky jelly incidents, phenomena documented, in various forms and under various names, in scattered locations around the world over the preceding centuries, some dating back well over 100 years. These accounts, often referred to collectively under names like star jelly in older folkloric traditions, describe similar gelatinous substances appearing without clear explanation, following unusual atmospheric events. And some researchers drawn to this broader historical pattern have wondered whether the Oakville incident might represent a modern instance of a phenomenon whose true cause has never been established across any of its reported occurrences. Ancient or contemporary alike, a question mainstream science has generally approached with considerable skepticism, given the difficulty of drawing firm conclusions from historical accounts that predate modern sampling and testing methods entirely. What ties all of these competing explanations together, regardless of which one an individual researcher finds most persuasive, is the fundamental incompleteness of the original 1994 investigation conducted with the tools and testing methods available at the time, and never revisited with the same intensity once public attention moved on to other matters. The samples that might have definitively settled the question have, in the decades since, degraded or been lost to routine institutional archiving practices that were never designed with an unresolved mystery's long-term forensic value in mind, leaving researchers today working largely from historical records, contemporary news accounts, and second-hand descriptions of laboratory results that were, even in 1994, treated as preliminary and inconclusive. Oakville today shows no trace of the morning in August 1994 when something fell from its sky and briefly made global headlines. Its lawns and streets long since returned to the same unremarkable suburban ordinariness they possessed before the incident, and have possessed in the decades since. And yet the questions the case raised about the limits of environmental testing, about the reliability of an official explanation never fully substantiated by hard evidence, and about what, precisely, residents were exposed to that morning, have never been definitively closed. Was it simply an unfortunate, undignified accident involving an aircraft's waste tank? An explanation mundane enough to be almost anticlimactic? Or did something considerably stranger drift down over Oakville that August morning, leaving behind a residue of illness and uncertainty that officials were never quite able to explain away? The samples are gone. The questions, evidently, are not. From the suburban lawns of Ontario, we travel back across the Atlantic, and back considerably further in time to the snow-covered countryside of South Devon, England, where residents woke one February morning in 1855 to find something inexplicable stamped across their landscape. South Devon, in the winter of 1855, was rural, agricultural, and devoutly religious in the manner typical of much of Victorian England. Its scattered villages, including Exmouth, Topsham, Dawlish, and Teignmouth, connected by farmland and coastline along the region's southern edge. On the night of February 8th into the morning of February 9th, a fresh snowfall blanketed the area, and when residents emerged the following morning, they discovered a series of tracks stretching across an extraordinary distance, reported at the time to cover somewhere between 100 and 150 kilometers, cutting across fields, gardens, rooftops, haystacks, and, in several accounts, even continuing directly over the tops of walls and buildings without any apparent break or deviation in the pattern. The tracks themselves were the source of the immediate and lasting fascination. Described by numerous witnesses and contemporary newspaper accounts as resembling a small, cloven hoof, roughly 4 inches in length, they proceeded in a single, continuous line, one print appearing directly in front of the last, a walking pattern investigators at the time found difficult to reconcile with any animal known to move on 4 legs, since a typical 4-legged creature leaves paired or staggered prints rather than a single unbroken line. Residents who examined the tracks reported that they appeared to pass over obstacles with no adjustment in stride or spacing, continuing in an unbroken line across the tops of walls several feet high, through narrow gaps between buildings, and, in some of the most widely repeated accounts, directly across rooftops, a detail that, if accurately reported, would seem to exclude almost any conventional explanation involving an ordinary earthbound animal. News of the tracks spread quickly through the region and then into the national press, generating a wave of public fascination and, inevitably, a considerable degree of religious and superstitious interpretation. In an era when belief in the literal presence of the devil remained widespread and largely unquestioned across much of rural England, the cloven hoof shape of the prints led many locals to conclude, without much hesitation, that the tracks represented the literal footprints of Satan himself, walking through the Devon countryside on some errand never explained to the God-fearing residents who discovered his trail the following morning. Church attendance in the affected villages reportedly increased noticeably in the days that followed, and some residents, according to contemporary accounts, refused to leave their homes after dark for a period following the incident, genuinely fearful of whatever had left the marks. Investigators and naturalists of the period, somewhat more skeptical than the general public, pursued a range of explanations rooted in known animal behavior, though each of these explanations has, in the century and a half since, encountered difficulties reconciling with the full scope of what was reported. The most frequently proposed mainstream theory involves badgers, rodents, or other small mammals moving through the snow under specific conditions that might produce a track resembling a continuous single line, particularly if multiple animals moved along the same general path, or if a lighter animal's prints partially melted and refroze in a manner that altered their apparent shape. Another commonly cited explanation involves hopping rodents, whose paired prints might, under the right conditions of snow depth and subsequent partial melting, blur together into what could be mistaken for a single continuous track. A theory involving a wandering donkey or pony, its hooves accumulating and then dropping small amounts of snow in a manner that produced an apparently cloven shape, was also proposed by some contemporary observers. Each of these theories, however, has struggled to fully account for the sheer distance the tracks reportedly covered in a single night, along with the multiple, independent witness accounts describing the prints crossing rooftops and continuing over walls without interruption, features considerably more difficult to explain through any single known animal's ordinary movement. However, the snow conditions that night might have distorted individual prints. Compounding the difficulty, no contemporary investigator was ever able to trace the tracks to a definitive starting or ending point, an origin or a destination that might have offered some indication of what, precisely, had made them, leaving the tracks as a phenomenon observed extensively in the middle of their apparent journey, but never conclusively tied to any point of departure or arrival. Beyond the animal-based explanations favored by more skeptical contemporary investigators, a range of alternative theories have circulated in the decades and centuries since. Some grounded in unusual but naturally occurring phenomena, others considerably more speculative. One frequently cited alternative theory involves ballooning spiders, a genuine and well-documented natural phenomenon in which certain spider species release strands of silk to catch the wind and travel considerable distances. And some researchers have proposed that a coordinated mass movement of such spiders, landing and briefly touching down across the snow in a pattern that happened to resemble footprints, might account for tracks covering unusual distances and crossing obstacles that would stop an earthbound animal entirely. This theory, while creative, has never been definitively demonstrated to produce tracks matching the specific size, shape, and spacing described in contemporary 1855 accounts. Other researchers, working from the meteorological conditions reported around the time of the incident, have proposed that unusual atmospheric conditions, potentially involving a specific combination of wind, temperature, and precipitation, might have caused droplets of some kind, whether condensation, meltwater, or another substance, to fall and freeze in a pattern that created the appearance of tracks without any animal involvement at all, a theory that would explain the tracks' unusual continuity, though it, too, has never been conclusively tested or proven against the specific conditions documented in Devon that February. And, inevitably, given the tracks' folkloric association with the devil from the very first morning they were discovered, more speculative and supernatural interpretations have persisted alongside the scientific theories in the years since, ranging from continued literal readings of the tracks as evidence of some malevolent supernatural presence, to broader theories connecting the incident to other reported instances of anomalous, unexplained tracks in snow documented in various parts of the world both before and after 1855, a pattern some researchers have suggested points toward a shared, unidentified phenomenon recurring across widely separated times and places, though mainstream science has generally treated these broader connections with considerable skepticism, given the difficulty of comparing incidents separated by such distances in both geography and historical record-keeping standards. What remains, more than a century and a half later, is a case built almost entirely on contemporary testimony rather than physical evidence, the tracks themselves having melted away within days of their discovery, leaving behind only newspaper accounts, letters, and second-hand descriptions for later researchers to work from. Evidence that, however extensive, has never allowed for the kind of forensic certainty later investigative techniques might have offered had the phenomenon occurred in a more modern era. Devon's snow has fallen and melted countless times since that February morning in 1855, and no comparable event at that scale has ever been documented again in the region. Was it simply an unusual combination of ordinary animals and unusual weather conditions, magnified by the fear and folklore of a devoutly religious Victorian countryside, primed to see the devil's hand in any sufficiently strange occurrence? Or did something genuinely unexplained pass through South Devon that night, leaving a trail its residents were only ever able to follow with their eyes, never quite catching up to whatever, or whoever, had made it? 7 centuries before those tracks appeared in the Devon snow, English soil had already produced one mystery so strange that medieval chroniclers, writing in an age far more accustomed to reporting the fantastic and unexplained than our own, still felt compelled to record it as something genuinely extraordinary. Woolpit, a small village in Suffolk, in the east of England, sat during the 12th century amid the kind of unremarkable agricultural landscape typical of medieval English countryside. Its name, by most accounts, derived from the wolf pits once used in the area to trap the predators that threatened local livestock. It was near these pits, sometime during the reign of King Stephen, in a period generally dated to the 1150s, that villagers reportedly encountered 2 children unlike any they had ever seen. A boy and a girl, their skin a distinct shade of green, dressed in clothing of an unfamiliar material and design, and speaking in a language no one in the village could understand. The account of the green children survives primarily through 2 medieval chroniclers, Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh, both writing within decades of the events they described, a detail that has lent the story a degree of historical credibility considerably greater than many of the folk tales and legends that circulated in medieval England, without any comparable written record close to the events themselves. According to these accounts, the 2 children were found near the wolf pits, disoriented and distressed, and were brought into the village, where they initially refused all food offered to them, surviving, according to the chroniclers, on nothing until someone thought to offer them raw beans, which the children apparently accepted and ate, this being, according to the accounts, the only food they would consume for some time afterward. The boy, weakened and unable to adapt to his new surroundings, reportedly died not long after the children's arrival in the village. The girl survived, and over time, according to the chroniclers, she learned to eat other foods, gradually lost the distinctive green coloration of her skin, and eventually learned to speak English well enough to offer some account of where she and her brother had come from. Her explanation, as recorded by the medieval chroniclers, described a land she called St. Martin's Land, a place she described as perpetually twilight, without direct sunlight, situated across some manner of water or boundary from the world in which she now found herself. According to her account, she and her brother had been tending their father's flocks when they heard a loud noise, possibly bells, and followed it into a cave or passage, emerging, disoriented, into the fields near Woolpit, unable to find their way back to the land they had left behind. Johanna, the girl, reportedly remained in the village, was baptized into the Christian faith, and eventually, according to some later accounts, married and lived out the remainder of her life among the community that had taken her in, her origins never definitively explained even to those who knew her best in the years that followed her arrival. Beyond this basic narrative, the medieval sources offer little further detail, and no physical evidence, no burial site confirmed to belong to the boy, no artifact connected to the children's original clothing or belongings has ever been recovered to substantiate the account beyond the written testimony of the two chroniclers who first recorded it. Historians examining the case in the centuries since have generally approached it as a piece of medieval folklore, likely containing, at its core, some kernel of genuine historical event, subsequently embellished through retelling into the more fantastical form in which it has survived. Several grounded explanations have been proposed over the years, seeking to identify a plausible historical basis for a story that, on its face, describes something difficult to reconcile with straightforward historical fact. One frequently cited theory suggests the children may have been Flemish immigrants, a population known to have settled in parts of England during this general period, whose unfamiliar language, distinctive traditional clothing, and possible malnourishment, a condition capable of producing a greenish skin tone through a real medical phenomenon known as chlorosis or green sickness, together might have led unfamiliar villagers to interpret the children's arrival as something considerably more mysterious than a straightforward case of displaced or orphaned immigrant children stumbling into unfamiliar territory. Under this reading, St. Martin's Land may reflect a genuine, if imprecisely translated or misunderstood, reference to a real location known to Flemish-speaking communities of the period, garbled through retelling into something considerably more otherworldly by the time it reached the chroniclers who recorded it decades later. This explanation, while grounded in known historical and medical realities of the period, has never been definitively proven, in large part because no specific historical event, whether local conflict, displacement, or documented immigration, has ever been conclusively identified as the source of two specific, individually documented children matching the details preserved in the medieval accounts. The chronicler's description of St. Martin's Land as a place of perpetual twilight, situated across some kind of boundary from the ordinary world, sits somewhat awkwardly within an explanation resting purely on immigration and malnutrition, a detail that has led some researchers to treat the surviving accounts as more heavily embellished folklore than reliable historical record, shaped by centuries of oral retelling before Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh ever committed it to writing. Beyond the immigration theory, other researchers drawn to the case's more fantastical elements have proposed considerably more speculative explanations, ranging from folkloric interpretations connecting the green children to older English traditions regarding fairies or other otherworldly beings, traditions well established in medieval English culture and capable of shaping how villagers might have understood and later described an encounter with unfamiliar, differently colored children, to more modern and considerably more fringe theories proposing extraterrestrial or interdimensional origins, drawing on the account's description of a land without direct sunlight and its unexplained method of arrival, a cave or passage leading unexpectedly into an entirely different landscape. Mainstream historians tend to treat these latter interpretations with considerable skepticism, given both the medieval context in which the original accounts were recorded and the near-total absence of corroborating physical evidence beyond the two chroniclers' written testimony. What endures, nearly 9 centuries later, is a story remarkably well documented for its era, recorded independently by 2 separate chroniclers within decades of the events described, and yet still fundamentally unresolved in its most basic particulars. Who were these 2 children, genuinely, and where did they actually come from? Was Woolpit's mystery simply a story of displaced, malnourished immigrant children, transformed through generations of retelling into something considerably stranger than its origin? Or does the persistent specific detail of St. Martin's Land, a place of perpetual twilight reached through some manner of passage, preserve a fragment of something medieval chroniclers encountered and simply lacked the framework to fully explain? Woolpit today remains a small, quiet Suffolk village. Its green children commemorated on a village sign rather than in any surviving physical evidence, a story whose central question, worn smooth by nearly 900 years of retelling, has never once been definitively answered.